Waterworks sustained Petra across about 100 BCE to 100 CE. The city sat in a sandstone basin reached by a narrow gorge. Crews managed rain, floods, and storage with measured steps. Channels, cisterns, and routine care linked canyons to courts. A faint courtyard breeze crossed stone and plaster. Somewhere nearby, a distant drip kept steady time. The sound stayed small and even. Petra lay in today's southern Jordan, framed by steep rose sandstone. Access from the east passed through the Sick, a tall, narrow corridor. Winter brought short bursts of rain over the hills. Summer stayed long and dry, with bright sun and thin shade. Floods rushed down gullies when storms struck the upland catchments. Engineers turned these moments into supply rather than damage. The plan joined high slopes to storage and then to daily use. Water came from scattered sources above and around the basin. Upland slopes fed wadis that reached the city edge. Builders placed small dams at canyon mouths to slow surge. Intake gates let measured flow enter the city system. Rock-cut channels hugged cliff walls and guided water toward storage. Covered runs reduced heat gain and kept dust away. Ceramic pipes crossed gaps and tight bends with simple collars. Trickle sounds moved under stone lids. Storage gave the city time between storms. Crews carved large cisterns into sandstone shoulders. Steps descended along one wall for cleaning and checks. Lime plaster sealed pores and joints against slow leaks. Some chambers sat high to provide pressure for lower streets. Others sat near houses for easy daily draw. When empty, these rooms held a quiet echo. When full, a cool smell rose from the water face. Safety shaped the works at the Esike, the main approach. Rock-cut channels ran along both walls to carry routine flow. A diversion tunnel sent floodwater around the walkway. Side inlets bled excess into settling basins near the gorge. Screens and traps caught leaves and grit before town. The passage remained usable when storms passed quickly. Footsteps sounded low against smoothed stone. Air cooled in the narrow shade. Distribution in town used simple nodes with covers. Junction boxes split supply toward markets and workshops. Plug stones and small gates adjusted flow by season. Crews lifted a lid, checked levels, and moved on. Counting marks on sherds likely tracked sections and days. The network stayed legible with short signs and repeated parts. Stone lids settled back with a dry sound. Street dust remained where it lay. Households drew from small cisterns and courtyard jars. Buckets lifted by rope or leather straps at fixed hours. Cooking, washing, and lamps received priority during the dry months. Drainage returned used water to gardens or dust control. Roof gutters led small rains into jars and tanks. Children carried light jars while adults hauled larger vessels. The pace remained even in public. Rope creaked. Water touched rims with a soft ring. Gardens and shade trees used planned overflow. Terrace beds along slopes took thin rills by gravity. Olive, fig, and vine plots sat behind low walls. Clay weirs shared flow between lanes without dispute. Soil took moisture slowly, then released it at dusk. Birds settled into branches near channels. Leaf rustle mixed with a soft rill under afternoon light. Narrow green strips cooled the nearby paths. Maintenance held the system together more than display. Inspectors walked routes after winds and storms. They brushed silt from inlets and cleared small stones. Plaster teams renewed seams on a seasonal plan. Potters replaced cracked pipe sections with new collars. Scribes marked tasks on sherds or wax tablets, then tied them in bundles. The same crews repeated the same checks in round order. Brush bristles whisked, sandals brushed dust. Materials stayed close to hand and plain. Stone came from nearby faces along planned lines. Plaster came from burned limestone and clean sand. Pipes came from kilns that served many needs. Wood served as formwork, where needed, then returned to stores. Tools included picks, chisels, adzes, and measuring cords. Buckets, ladles, and scoops moved with the crews. Each piece had a clear place on a shelf or bench. Time and rule sat in simple anchors. The work belonged to the Nabataean kingdom in this period. Roman-era repairs appeared later without strong contrast. Carvings along the sick matched dates near the 1st century. Plaster layers and pipe sockets showed careful rows. Dams and basins stood at canyon mouths. Notes and marks stayed near the objects. Attention remained on parts and joins rather than praise. Counting and control relied on predictable steps. A gauge stone showed a target depth at a tank. A notch marked a safe level in a channel. A clay seal on a lid recorded the last check day. A scratched line on a sherd logged a team's circuit. These small signs reduced talk at work sites. They kept shifts short and repairs timely. The soundscape remained light and regular. Public rooms drew share from the same system. Fountains ran in measured strands during busy days. Baths observed set hours and priority for cleaning. Workyards used water for stone cutting and dust control. Markets kept jars for washing hands and weighing herbs. Animals drank at troughs placed near shade. Overflow returned to gardens where possible. A constant economy of movement reduced loss. Flood control stayed within the plan. Bypass works channeled sudden surges around lived spaces. Lower streets included sacrificial lanes for rare overflow. Door thresholds sat above ground level by 1 or 2 steps. Sills showed wear from many seasons of use. A long ditch beyond town carried spent water toward fields. Storms were expected and received. Paths for water kept the city standing. Trade met water stations near approaches to Petra. Caravan grounds offered troughs and refill jars under roofed shade. A steward measured out water by unit, not by guess. Animals rested while packs were checked and shifted. Rope clinked on ring posts along the court. A small breeze crossed the open ground. The station kept traffic moving without long waits. The line continued past the gate. Archaeology preserved the main outlines of this network. Channels carved into bedrock still trace along cliffs. Pipe sockets remain in walls where streets turned. Lime plaster survives in cisterns as thin, pale layers. Diversion cuts show careful geometry near the gorge. Copper stains mark old fixtures in a few places. Repair patches record long maintenance over these centuries. Brushes tick gently over compact soil in these rooms. Methods spread by repetition rather than decree. Apprentices learned tool angles at benches with supervisors. They measured slope with cords and small levels. They learned to see silt points and stress points. Routes were traced on walls with charcoal. Errors stayed local and were fixed in place. Lessons remained in hands and schedules. The city endured because routines endured. Across Petra, sounds remained small and exact. Stone lids touched seats with a dry tap. Water moved under covers with a soft line. Plasterers scraped and smoothed in steady strokes. Potters tested joints with a single clean knock. Courtyard breezes kept shade comfortable through the middle day. Distant drips kept time in carved rooms. These cues held the account together. Maps and site plans show the network with simple clarity. Upland catchments meet canyon mouths at measured points. The cyc carries the approach to the central basin. Cisterns mark higher slopes and junctions lie within town. Terrace gardens step down the side valleys. A bypass tunnel arcs near the gorge. The view returns to a shaded court where air moves lightly. A distant drip continues without hurry. The uplands above Petra received short winter storms and long, dry summers. Most rain fell in brief pulses carried from the west. Engineers planned to catch these pulses before they cut dangerous gullies. Their work began around 100 BCE and continued into the 1st century CE. The goal was simple: slow water, guide water, and store water. They used stone, clay, lime plaster, and shaped earth. Dry air often carried fine grit along the ground. Wind hissed softly over crusted soil and bedrock. Survey teams walked the ridges and shallow valleys before any walls rose. They mapped each catchment, the area where rain naturally drained to one point. A staff, a cord, and charcoal marks guided their notes. They set small cairns to fix lines across the slopes. They paced distances and counted steps rather than guess. A simple board with a sight hole kept alignments true. When light was low, edges and dips stood out clearly. Wind moved dust against boots in a faint scrape. Crews read old storm signs to place first works. Desert varnish on rock showed common flow paths. Thin crusts on soil showed sheet runoff zones. Fresh rills showed where small walls would fail without anchors. They scratched reference marks on bedrock where channels would meet. They tied fiber cords between cairns to hold a root. Sand rasped lightly under soles. Loose pebbles clicked. Nothing rushed. The plan grew with many short checks rather than one grand line. Setting a safe slope for channels mattered most. A channel needed fall, but not too much fall. Teams measured gradient, the rate a surface drops over distance, with a water level. A shallow trough filled with water acted as a straight guide. The bubble line told if the cut fell evenly. Crews moved a few finger widths left or right to avoid weak ground. They marked acceptable drops with shortcuts on stone. Gravel gave a low crunch as workers shifted position. Small dams arrested fast water in gully bottoms. A check dam, a short barrier built across a small channel, forced water to slow and drop silt. Builders laid dry stone faces against a packed clay core. They keyed stones into bedrock at both ends. A shallow spill sill let water pass without tearing the wall. The top leaned upstream to resist push from floods. Workers tamped fill with wooden rammers in calm, regular strokes. Earth thudded softly under each lift. Diversion weirs split the flow toward storage and away from footpaths. A weir, a low-shaped barrier used to control water level, set a firm threshold. Carved notches bled part of the stream into a rock-cut intake. The main course continued down its old line after storms passed. Screens at inlets stopped branches and leaves. Silt traps waited a few steps inside to calm the water. When water rose, it murmured against stone, and then thinned. Air felt cooler near active inlets. Surface work improved runoff, where slopes were rough. Crews trimmed small ledges that held puddles and lost flow to seepage. They burnished smooth tongues of bedrock with heavy stones. On crumbly ground, they packed earth with tampers and added lime. In places, they brushed on thin plaster to close pores. Stone guides called liners kept water from wandering downslope. The treated surfaces shone faintly when damp. A smoothing stone made a dry, even squeak across rock. Channels followed contours with a gentle, steady drop. Workers cut a shallow trench close to the hillside and lined it with stone. Where sun and wind were harsh, they added lids of flat slabs. Lids reduced evaporation and kept grit out. At small ravines, ceramic pipes bridged the gap. Potters made short tubes and collar sleeves for tight joints. Joints took a ring of fine mortar and a wrap of cloth. A light tap on each tube rang once, then stopped. Settling basins punctuated long runs to remove sand. A basin widened the line and lowered speed so silt could drop. Steps cut into one side allowed entry for cleaning. A dip at the outlet held back the last load of grit. After storms, crews scraped the floor with wooden scoops. A brush whisked fine dust toward a basket. The material later filled low spots along nearby paths. Tools clicked lightly, and notes went onto a sherd in short lines. Paths linked all parts of the catchment for routine checks. Inspectors walked the same circuits after each winter burst. They cleared screens, checked joints, and pressed loose stones back. Cracks in plaster received quick washes and a fresh coat. Scribes likely marked dates and sections on small tags for baskets. The wind moved over open ground with a dry hiss. The system stayed sound because small tasks happened in time. Flood safety stayed inside the design without drama. Bypass cuts offered relief when storms exceeded common loads. Overflow fields accepted spare water and silts gently. Boulder sills broke force before it reached a wall. On sharp bends, interfaces wore protective stone armor. When a rare larger rush passed, it moved along planned paths. The sound rose to a low rush in the gully, and then eased. Crews returned the next day to clear basins and check spill sills. Markers and gauges kept memory in place across seasons. A carved notch on a weir face showed safe depth. A row of holes on a spillway showed last year's crest. A short stake line marked where sheet flow should turn. Painted symbols on stones directed crews to stored materials. These signs reduced talk and mistakes during quick repairs. Hand signals and brief words were enough at distance. Dry air brought a smell of warm stone and lime. Intake gates guarded the handoff to the city's main lines. Stone thresholds met carved channels that aimed toward the gorge. A plugstone could close an inlet if a lower basin was full. A small board and peg gate could trim flow in shoulder seasons. Watchers checked these points after each storm. They listened for the sound of continuous trickle. If the tone dropped, they walked upstream to the last basin. Sandals brushed grit from smooth steps. Materials stayed local and simple. Quarry faces along the ridge supplied slabs and blocks. Clay came from banks near the wadis. Lime for plaster came from burned limestone with clean sand. Timber served only where necessary and returned to stores. Tools included picks, chisels, rammers, trowels, and buckets. A water level, cords, and pegs kept grades and lines. Nothing in the kit was complex. Each item had a clear task. Seasonal timing controlled workloads. Before winter, crews inspected all key points. They added fresh plaster skins, tested joints, and cleared brush. During winter bursts, watchers stayed near intake gates and screens. After storms, teams spread out along routes with baskets and scoops. In dry months, repairs took place without pressure. Plaster cured well under steady heat. Tools dried quickly and returned to shelves. The schedule repeated year to year with small changes. Evidence for these upland works remains on the slopes. Low terrace walls cross shallow fans in regular steps. Check dams sit keyed into bedrock with spill sills intact. Plastered patches cling to channels shaded by overhangs. Pipe collars appear where gullies once carried narrow bridges. Cuts for gauges and peg holes line weirs. Silted basins still hold fine, compact soil. Archaeologists note tool marks and patch sequences that suit early Roman decades. The catchment plan supported Petra's larger network without show. It delivered water calmly at rates channels could hold. It protected the main approach from sudden surges. It filled hillside cisterns that fed districts by gravity. It left clean sand in basins and moved coarser stones downslope. Its sounds were light, grit moving, water settling, tools tapping. Dry air and wind-carried grit moved across the stone. The city below waited with lids, pipes, and jars. At the approaches to Petra, narrow gullies met wider beds of worn stone. Here, engineers built diversion dams during 100 BCE, 100 CE. These low structures slowed sudden flows and held water long enough to measure entry. They sent part into intake gates, while the rest continued safely downslope. The work belonged to the early Roman era of the Nabataean city. Dry air pressed along the canyon walls. A low water murmur touched blocks when storms arrived, then faded to stillness. Surveyors set dam lines only where ground was sound. They chose abutments that keyed into bedrock and resisted scour. Cords, pegs, and cut marks laid out the crest, spillway, and intake. A simple water level confirmed even fall across the weir. Gauge stones fixed target heights for seasonal flows. Short notches showed where extra water would pass without harm. The plan used compact steps rather than large leaps. Wind-carried grit brushed tools and pack baskets along the staging ground. Foundations began with a trench to clean rock. Crews removed loose gravel and brushed dust from joints. A cut-off wall, a buried barrier to block underflow, sat in the trench to stop leaks. Packed clay formed the wall's core, with stone cheeks on both sides. Workers tamped the fill with wooden rammers in steady strokes. The sound was a quiet thud, repeated at a calm pace. When the clay rose to the surface, lines of stone climbed beside it. Faces of the dam stood from dressed blocks. Masons set the upstream face with a slight lean against water push. The downstream face rose in steps to break falling water. Between the faces, the core held compact clay and rubble. Lime mortar sealed joints where needed. Stone headers tied the two faces across the fill. A key course locked the dam ends into the canyon walls. The structure looked low and broad, built for control rather than height. A spillway managed ordinary floods without shock. The crest carried a central notch cut to a fixed depth. During storms, water crested the notch first and slid onto a stone apron. Below, a stilling basin slowed the fall and saved the bed from scour. Rounded cobbles lined this basin to spread force. Baffle stones at the basin's lip sent water back to quiet. When the storm eased, the basin emptied with a soft swirl. The notch shone wet against dry blocks. Intake gates sat to one side of the dam, not on the crest. A short head race led from a side weir into a carved channel. Stone jambs framed the opening with grooves for screens or boards. A plug stone could close the gate when lower storage was full. In shoulder seasons, a small board and peg device trimmed the flow. Watchers listened for continuous trickle that meant healthy supply. If sound dropped, they checked screens for leaves and driftwood. Sediment control began at the inlet. A first settling pit widened the line and calmed the stream. Sand fell to the floor while cleaner water passed to the channel. Steps cut into one wall allowed entry for cleaning after each storm. A shallow sill at the outlet held back the last rush of grit. Downstream, a covered run reduced evaporation and kept dust out. At a small ravine, ceramic pipes bridged a gap with sleeve joints. A light tap on each joint rang once, then stopped. Training walls guided overbank water back toward the bed. These low walls ran from the dam ends along both margins. They kept flood sheets from chewing at soft banks. At sharp bends, Stone armor lined the inner curve against impact. Overflow routes crossed worn rock where footing held well. A relief notch on one shoulder let rare, higher flows bypass the intake. When a larger rush came, water spread as planned and then thinned. The SIQ approach stayed passable after storms. Materials came from close by. Quarries along the slopes supplied blocks with square, workable faces. Clay came from banks near the wadi floor, screened by hand. Lime for mortar burned in clamp kilns using brushwood and scrap. Sand came from clean bars, not dusty lenses. Tools were simple: picks, chisels, mallets, rammers, shovels, and rope slings. Stone saws and chisels made a dry, regular tap. Shovels scraped softly as crews trimmed the basin floor. Construction moved in measured phases. First came foundation cleaning and the cutoff wall. Next rose the faces and core in alternating lifts. Then masons cut the notch and set the apron stones. Finally, the intake structure and settling pit took shape. Each phase paused for checks with the water level and the gauge marks. Supervisors marked heights on stones with charcoal lines. A scribe noted dates and crews on a sherd tag. The site sounded ordered, not hurried. Maintenance kept the inlets useful for many years. After each winter burst, inspectors cleared screens and pulled debris from the crest. Workers scraped silt from the settling pit into baskets. Clay cores received a wet press where cracks formed. Mortar joints were repointed with thin, fresh paste. Loose apron stones were reset and wedged. Gauge stones were brushed clean so marks stayed clear. Notes on sherds tracked which pit was due next. Sandals brushed grit on the dry crest. Safety features were present, but spare. A secondary spill cut occupied higher ground for very large surges. Boulder sills above the dam broke incoming force. A warning groove showed when to close the intake briefly. Downstream, extra training walls guarded paths to the city. The design accepted storms without strain. When water rose, the murmur on stone thickened but held its line. When water fell, a few eddies turned and then went still. Evidence for such works remains near Petra's approaches. Low dams sit keyed into bedrock with clear spill aprons. Side inlets with jam grooves appear beside weirs. Stilling basins preserve cobble pavements beneath later silts. Gauge cuttings remain on crest stones. Repairs show alternating mortar types across decades. These parts fit the early Roman years of the city. The setting still holds dry air, with wind-carried grit moving across the stone. The dams formed the hinge between upland catchments and town supply. They slowed floods from the hills and fed storage by measure. They defended the Sek and nearby lanes from sudden force. They relied on common materials, steady tools, and short routines. Low water murmur met a quiet thud of tamped earth during their making. The Sik was a long, tight passage with high sandstone walls. It formed the eastern approach to Petra during 100 BCE, 100 CE. Its floor bent and narrowed, with polished rock from many feet. Engineers turned this corridor into a managed path for water and people. They kept flow against the walls and kept the walkway dry. Footfalls softened on the worn surface, while a steady trickle traced the rock. The air felt cool, and sound moved in a long, low echo. Planning began with simple lines on stone. Crews marked a safe slope for water along both walls. A cord, pegs, and a water level guided each mark. The goal was a gentle drop that kept flow moving but calm. Too little fall would make pools and silt. Too much fall would erode channels and joints. Small cuts on the wall showed the future route. Charcoal lines linked the cuts in even segments. The tools scraped softly as marks advanced. Workers cut the channels by hand in short sections. Picks opened the first notch in the sandstone. Chisels widened it to a U shape that was easy to clean. The floor of the cut held a narrow fillet that guided the thread of water. Where the path bent, the outer wall carried the line a little higher. This kept depth steady at turns. Stone dust rose and settled as crews worked. A brush whisked the floor before each check with the level. Many stretches received covers to reduce loss. Flat stone lids rested on small ledges cut into the wall. Lids kept grit out and shaded the water from sun and wind. Gaps at intervals allowed air and inspection. A lid lifted, a hand checked the run, and the lid returned. The fit made a dry, exact sound when stone met stone. Covered reaches kept the trickle quiet, like breath against rock. Open reaches showed water bright against the smooth channel floor. Some parts needed pipes rather than open cuts. Crews carved a bench on the wall and set ceramic tubes along it. Each tube met the next with a collar, a short sleeve that joins two pipe ends. A ring of thin mortar sealed the joint. Cloth wrap added strength when walls moved a little. Pipelines bridged small gaps and doorways without breaking the walkway. A light tap on each tube sent a quick ring that faded at once. The series looked simple and plain. At intervals, settling boxes calmed the line. A settling box was a small chamber that widened the channel so sand could drop. A dip at the outlet held back the last rush of grit. Steps cut into one side let crews enter with scoops. Screens sat in grooves at the inlet to stop leaves and twigs. After a storm, a worker brushed sand toward a basket. The scrape stayed soft against the floor. The box returned the water to clear, thin flow. Where small gullies met the sick, controls guarded the main line. Low weirs kept side flows from crossing the walk. Short spurs returned water to the wall channels. On sharp bends, stone armor covered inner corners against impact. Relief notches on high points bled rare. High water away from the path. The arrangement favored many small actions over one large one. Water stayed close to the walls, and people stayed to the middle. Footsteps and trickles kept their distance. In places, the channel stepped down through tiny falls. A step softened drop without making foam. The face of each step sloped to spread force. Below, a small pocket slowed the thread and let air leave. These pockets looked like shallow cups in the rock. They kept sound low and controlled. The thread slid and paused and slid again. The echo stayed even along the run. Scaffolds left short holes that still show in the walls. Workers placed light beams in those sockets to stand above the path. From there, they cut and checked the higher lines. When a section finished, the beams came down and holes stayed. Small ledges chiseled beneath the channels held lids and pipes. Tool marks remained in regular bands that match long, careful work. A fine rasping sound would have marked each pass of the chisel. Walkway care worked with the water plan. Curbs stood a hand's height above the floor to keep stray threads out. Cross drains sent small puddles back to the wall channels. Sills at doorways lifted thresholds above splash. Treads were smoothed by many feet and by planned scraping. Crews brushed dust from the floor after storms. A faint grit sound moved ahead of the brooms. The corridor stayed clean enough for steady passage. Maintenance followed a set circuit after each winter burst. Inspectors walked from inlet to outlet with baskets and tools. They lifted lids, cleared screens, and pressed mortar into hairline cracks. They replaced a broken pipe with a fresh tube from stores. A worker checked slope with a water level and recut where stone had bulged. Scribes likely marked each section and day on a sherd. The notes rode in a cord bundle. The job was slow and sure. Materials traveled short distances to reach the gorge. Sandstone came from beds near the route itself. Potters made tube sections in town kilns and carried them by cart. Mortar used lime from clamp kilns and sand from clean bars. Timber for boards and pegs returned to stores after work. Iron tools were few and valued: pick, chisel, adze, and hammer. A measuring cord held knots at regular spans. Nothing was elaborate. Each item served a single, plain task. Intake points to the SEQ channels used calm devices. A small side weir from the diversion dams fed the first cut. A plug stone could close the feed when lower tanks were full. Pegged boards narrowed flow in shoulder seasons. Watchers listened for the constant tone of water against stone. If the sound thinned, they checked the last settling box and the screens. The check took minutes because pieces sat where hands expected them. Safety for large storms lived beside daily order. A bypass tunnel near the canyon carried floodwater away from the walkway. The entrance sat above normal levels and only took water in surge. Training walls guided overbank threads back to bedrock. Stones at tight bends were keyed deeper into the wall. These features sat quiet most days. When needed, they worked without surprise. The sound rose, moved past, and then fell again. Evidence in the SIQ shows this system's shape. Long wall cuts run at a steady height along both sides. Seats for lids still carry stone covers in some stretches. Pipe benches appear where channels break to cross gaps. Box widenings and step pockets remain, filled with fine silt. Grooves for screens show near inlets. Holes for beams lie in pairs at working heights. Plaster patches cling under overhangs where sun was softer. The pattern fits early Roman decades. The corridor also carried small signs for crews. Carved notches marked gauge levels in the line. Dots beside a lid seat named a section for inspection. A cut letter-like mark showed a junction box number. Painted signs likely lived on stone for short periods and then faded. Such marks kept teams aligned when tasks moved quickly. Hand gestures and short words were enough for the rest. The gorge carried a low, ordered hum in work hours. The 6 water plan supported the city network beyond it. From the exit, channels split toward markets, cisterns, and workshops. High tanks served distant quarters with pressure. Junction boxes with covers moved the thread by measure. Terrace gardens received planned overflow during dry months. The narrow gorge, once a risk, became a controlling valve. The same flow that entered at the dams arrived here as an even line. Daily life passed beside these quiet tools. Officials, traders, and workers walked the corridor. Animals stepped where the floor was wide. The water stayed to its route under lids and along cuts. People and goods moved without splash or delay. Sound remained modest: footfall, drip, lid tap, and the faint brush of cloth. Cold air pooled near the floor. Sunlight crossed the upper rock in narrow bands. Training for the corridor crews stayed practical. New workers learned to hold the chisel at a safe angle. They learned to set the slope with a water level and cord. They learned to seat a lid so it did not rock. They learned how to listen for the right trickle tone that meant no block. They learned to reline a joint with a thin mortar wash. Corrections were small and made on site. The line carried on. Records did not need long text to keep order. A board at the exit named which sections were due that week. A shirred tag hung from a cord on the inspector's basket. The tag gained marks as lids opened and screens cleared. At day's end, the tag returned to a peg near the store. The next team picked it up and continued the route. Paper rustle was rare. Stone and clay held the memory of work. In this way, the Sikh became a reliable corridor for both feet and water. It turned steep walls and narrow turns into measured lines and small devices. It kept dust out of channels and kept flood out of the path. It prepared water for storage and used deeper in the city. Footfalls softened where the floor was smooth. A steady trickle traced the rock and stayed low in sound. The gorge felt cool and controlled in the early light and late day. Along the outer paths near Petra, engineers protected water from sun and dust. The years were roughly 100 BCE to 100 CE. Heat raised loss from open runs, and wind drove grit into shallow cuts. Covered channels solved both issues with simple parts. Stone lids shaded the flow, and plastered caps sealed joints. The result was a narrow, cool space just above the water. A light draft slipped along the underside and left a faint whisper. Crews first prepared benches on the rock face. They cut a level seat for the channel and a higher ledge for the lids. A water level and cord kept the drop gentle and even. Small chisel marks showed each next segment before cutting. The trench held a U-shaped bed that was easy to clean. Where the cliff bulged, the line stepped slightly outward on blockwork. Where the cliff narrowed, the line rose a hand's width to keep depth. Tools tapped in a steady rhythm, and stone dust settled in thin films. Stone lids began at nearby quarries, with flat-bedded sandstone. Slabs were trimmed to a repeatable span, so two people could lift one. Edges were squared to sit close with few gaps. Seating rebates, shallow recesses that locate a lid, were cut into the ledge. A thin smear of lime mortar filled faint irregularities. The lid lowered by hand, and a sling. A dry, exact sound told the fit was right. Joints met cleanly, then disappeared under a brush of fine sand. Not every reach could take heavy slabs. In places, crews formed plastered caps instead. They built low sidewalls of stones and laid thin vaults across the span. The vault received 2 or 3 coats of lime plaster. The mix used burned limestone with clean sand and sometimes crushed potsherd for strength. Each coat cured before the next wash. A final burnish shed dust and shed heat. Caps weighed less than stone lids and could span awkward bends. Their smooth undersides guided the trickle without eddies. Vent and inspection points appeared at measured steps. Every few spans, a lid carried a small lift notch. Every long cap held a square opening with a cover plate. These points let crews check flow, remove grit, and admit air. Vent spacing balanced freshness with loss control. In the shade, air cooled and moved slowly. A thin draft traced the channel with a low hiss. The water stayed bright, and surfaces stayed free of growth. Edges mattered for keeping grit out. Lid seats received a raised lip on the windward side. Caps received a shallow drip groove at the outer edge. Curbs along the path kept foot dust from sliding inward. Where animals passed, a second curb stood outside the first. Cross drains returned stray puddles to the intake side. Each element was small, but together they kept the line clean. The path remained clear for carts and feet. Joints needed slight freedom for heat and movement. Stone lids met with tiny shims of fiber and thin mortar. Caps received hairline expansion joints at fixed intervals. These joints were closed with flexible plaster and a dusting of sand. When the rock warmed by day and cooled by night, the closures flexed. Cracking stayed local and simple to patch. Inspectors learned to see faint lines and to touch them with a fingertip. Repairs took minutes and returned the joint to plain sight. Where cliffs broke at small ravines, the covered channel crossed on short bridges. A base of stones formed a sill. On it sat collars and ceramic tubes, then a cap of thin vaulting. The tube line kept grade, and the cap kept sun off. At the landing, the covered run returned to a cut bench. Below the bridge, a spill apron faced the ravine bed against drops. The run sounded unchanged above, and the ravine stayed quiet below. When wind rose, the cap kept grit from reaching the thread. Settling pockets hid beneath lids at set intervals. A pocket widened the floor and lowered speed so sand could fall. The outlet rose slightly, holding back the last load of grit. Steps on one side allowed entry with scoops. After storms, crews lifted selected lids, scraped the pockets, and closed them again. Basket loads of sand went to low spots along the path. Lids returned to their seats with the same dry touch. Water resumed its thin, even line. Interfaces with junction boxes stayed covered as well. A box split the flow toward a market or a lane. Its cover lifted by rings set in stone. Inside, plug stones and small gates adjusted the share. A gauge notch on the far wall showed the planned level. Crews recorded positions on a sherd in simple marks. The lid settled back, and no change showed from the path. The box worked out of sight, and the main line kept its sound. Materials and making followed a regular chain. Stone came from benches near the route, trimmed on site. Lime plaster came from clamp kilns in the foothills. Sand came from clean bars, screened by hand. Potters shaped tube sections and collar sleeves in town kilns. Stores kept spare lids in a shaded yard, stacked on wood to prevent damage. Tools included chisels, adzes, trowels, mallets, and measuring cords. Rope slings and wooden levers moved heavier pieces. Work stayed quiet and low to the rock. Crews moved by schedule rather than alarm. Before winter, they examined caps and lids across the outer runs. Hairline cracks received a thin wash. Loose sand was brushed from seats. Screens at upstream inlets were tested and brushed clean. During winter bursts, watchers stood near vent points and junctions. They listened for the steady tone of the thread. After storms, teams spread out with baskets and scoops. Pockets were cleared, seats brushed, and covers reset. In dry months, plaster patches cured well under steady heat. Numbers and signs helped keep order without long speech. A small numeral cut on a lid showed its span in the sequence. A dot beside the mark showed a vent point due for check. A letter-like sign near a cap ring named the junction box within. Gauge stones near selected vents carried last year's high mark. Sherd tags tied to baskets showed section and day. At sunset, tags returned to a peg near the stores. The next crew found them and continued the line. Covered runs also improved water quality. Shade kept temperature low and slowed loss by vapor. Calm air under lids kept dust from settling on the thread. Tiny insects were screened out at first inlets. Thin films did not form where light could not reach. Where light leaked at vents, a periodic wipe kept surfaces clear. Storage cisterns downstream benefited from this clean supply. Silt rested in pockets uphill, not in tanks that took time to drain. Path design matched the covered lines. Curbs sat just high enough to stop splash without tripping feet. Step treads near caps were shaved to a uniform rise. Cart ruts were kept shallow and away from lid seats. At narrow places, a small timber rail guided traffic outward. Sound stayed soft, footfall on smooth stone, a brief lid tap, and the thin whisper under covers. The path belonged to daily life, not ceremony. Repairs used plain methods and short holds. A cracked cap received a chisel edge to open the line, then a wet brush to clean it. Fresh plaster went in thin coats, pressed with the heel of the trowel. A burnish with a smooth stone closed the surface. A lid with a broken corner swapped for a spare from stores. A faulty seat saw a smear of thin mortar and sand. The thread stayed in service while one span slept for an hour. The rest of the line continued to feed town. Caution for rare surges remained in the plan. Relief notches sat higher than daily levels and led to spill paths. Training ribs along the cliff face turned stray sheets back to the bed. At selected bays, caps rose to let a high sheet pass over without prying. Boulders set above the line broke force before it reached a lid seat. When a strong burst came, the system flexed and held. Afterward, crews walked the route and pressed each cover in turn. Archaeology preserves many of these parts along the outer paths. Bench cuts with lid seats still line the rock. Stone covers remain in place in shaded runs. Vent plates sit nearby, worn smooth at the edges. Plaster skins cling to vaults and protected corners. Collar fragments and tube sections lie where ravines once bridged. Gauge cuts and lid numerals appear in small, careful signs. These traces fit the early Roman decades at Petra and the steady routine suggested here. Covered lines linked upland, capture to urban storage with few losses. They carried water across hot, open faces without exposing it. They masked movement where wind and dust were strongest. They allowed quick checks by lifting a stone and listening close. The sound told if the line was free. A cool draft slipped under lids with a light whisper. The water under that shade stayed bright and thin, ready for basins, cisterns, and taps deeper in the city. Training for this work remained practical and brief. New hands learned to cut a ledge square and smooth. They learned to set a lid flush by touch and sound. They learned to mix plaster in the right ratio, then to rest it. They learned to number spans and to hang sherd tags on cords. They learned to hear the steady tone of a healthy run. Corrections were small and immediate. The line's order came from many careful minutes, repeated many times. Daily scenes along these runs were quiet. A worker lifted a vent plate and felt cool air on the palm. A brush cleared a fine drift of sand from a seat. A scoop raised a half basket of silt from a pocket. A lid settled with a firm, dry knock. Far below, a junction box cover lifted and closed. Above, sun warmed the cliff, but the line stayed shaded. The path continued along the face. The trickle kept its course beneath, thin and steady, without display. In the mid-1st century CE, crews in Petra used ceramic pipes to span gaps and turn tight bends. Potters formed straight tube sections and short collar sleeves that linked them. Pipe strings ran along benches cut in rock, crossed small ravines, and slipped behind walls. The aim stayed simple: carry a steady thread with few losses. Gentle tapping on finished clay rang once, then settled to quiet. The sound confirmed sound walls and clean joints. Work began at clay pits near the foothills. Clay was dug, soaked, and mixed with temper, crushed grit that reduced cracking. Workers stomped and folded the mass until the blend felt even. A wire cut showed if pockets remained inside. If the edge looked smooth, the batch moved forward. The air smelled faintly of damp earth. Wet lumps rested under damp cloths, waiting their turn beside the wheel and the mold boards. Potters shaped tubes by two methods. One used the wheel with a wooden mandrel to guide a constant bore. The other used half molds that came together around a wrapped stick. Either way, each tube kept a repeat length for simple joins. Ends were trued with a straight edge so collars would seat. Collar sleeves were thicker. Shorter pieces made only to join two tubes. A small groove inside helped hold mortar at the joint. Hands left faint. Regular spirals on the clay. Green tubes dried in the shade on racks. Drying took days in Petra's air, which was warm and dry. Slower drying reduced warping and cracks. Racks stood under awnings that broke wind without blocking air. A potter's straight rod rolled inside each tube to check roundness. If the rod met friction, the tube returned to the board for a careful scrape. The scrape sounded light and even. White dust showed where a high spot had been. Firing used clamp kilns that burned brushwood and scrap. Tubes stacked on edge, then alternated direction to spread heat. Collar sleeves filled gaps and locked the load. A low, steady fire rose through the day and held into night. The kiln breathed a warm hiss through small vents. When the load cooled, foremen tapped each tube near the end. A clear ring meant good vitrification. A dull thud sent the piece to a waster pile for fill. Some pieces received a thin slip wash for smoother walls. The slip was a fine clay slurry brushed inside before full drying. It reduced friction and caught less lime scale later. Most pieces needed no glaze. Where water was slightly mineral, crews later brushed a lime wash along inner walls. The wash left a pale film and helped seal pores. All steps remained simple, light, and repeatable across batches. Finished tubes moved to a yard near the root. Straw and reed mats separated layers on carts. Sherd tags named batch, length, and count. Collars rode in baskets with spare mortar pots and cloth wraps. A scribe marked the day's issue on a wax tablet. The tablet closed with a strap. Wheels creaked once on a slope, then steadied. At staging points, stacks rested on wood rails so edges did not chip. Installation started with the bench. Masons cut a level shelf into sandstone and brushed away dust. A thin bed of lime mortar marked the line. A water level and cord set a safe fall. The first tube seated against a small stopstone called a check. Mortar rings went around both ends. A collar sleeve slid over the joint until it bridged the seam. A light tap with a wooden mallet brought the collar home. The clay rang once, then stopped. The seam received a final wipe. Alignment mattered at every joint. Crews used a straight rod through two tubes to confirm the bore. If light narrowed at a mismatch, the end was trued with a rasp. Where bends were needed, short tubes combined with angled collars. On sharper turns, masons added a small thrust block of stone. The block took side force, so joints stayed true. Joints worked in compression under gentle head. Sound stayed modest along the run. Where a ravine interrupted the bench, pipes crossed on a short bridge. Builders laid two stone sills across the gap. On the sills, they set supports at the elevation of the pipe seat. The string passed on collar joints, then received a thin vault cap to shade it. A spill apron lined the ravine floor below. The pipe's tone did not change above, and the ravine kept quiet below. Wind spilled over the cap without driving grit to the thread. Some runs slipped behind walls or through narrow doors. There, masons cut a bench into the masonry itself. A cover stone protected the line and carried foot traffic. Inspection openings appeared at set intervals. Their plugs lifted by a ring, then settled back with a dry click. Inside, a small pocket allowed sand to drop before the next length. After storms, a scoop cleared the pocket in a minute. The lid returned, and the thread continued. Joint recipes stayed consistent across teams. Mortar mixed as lime and clean sand, sometimes with hair fiber. The fiber helped small joints flex when rock warmed by day. In a few places, crews perhaps used resin or bitumen for extra seal. When they did, the coat stayed thin and sat behind the collar edge. Excess wiped away with a dry cloth. A dusting of sand hid the shine and protected from sun. The odor stayed faint and passed. Vent points near long shaded runs kept air fresh under covers. A small opening sat above a collar, so disturbance stayed local. The opening had a cap that turned aside wind and dust. A hand felt a cool draft moving along the bore. If the tone of flow thinned, inspectors checked the near pocket and the last screen. The check came first by ear and then by eye. The routine took little time and prevented long stoppage. Connections to junction boxes used simple fittings. A T-box sat below the main string with a short riser. Plug stones or small gates inside set the share by ring marks. A gauge notch inside the box showed the planned level. When a district needed more, the stone moved one ring down. The cover closed, and the path showed nothing new. The main pipe kept grade, and the sideline carried its part toward a cistern or market. Household takeoffs rarely met the main strings directly. Most drew from lower channels or small tanks. Where a pipe did feed a court, a small branch rose with a collar and plug. Owners opened it on fixed hours during dry months. A short spout filled jars without waste. Rope creaked as a jar lifted from the floor. Water kissed the rim, then rested under a cloth cover. The branch closed, and the pipe returned to quiet. Scale formed slowly inside some lengths. Crews treated it without strain. A thin tool with a wrapped end swept the bore through an inspection opening. A few strokes dislodged powder into the pocket. A cup lifted it out. The inner wall then received a light lime wash if needed. The wash filled pores and left a pale skin. Water sounded brighter on a fresh surface. The pocket plug seated with a dry touch. Training for pipe crews matched the city's careful style. New hands learned to read fall with a water level. They learned to square ends, seat collars, and hear a good ring. They learned to mix thin mortar and to clean excess at once. They learned to carry tubes on slings without edge knocks. They learned to mark each length with a number and a crew sign. Corrections were small and on site. The line stayed open while a span changed. Records stayed short and clear. Shirred tags named section and day. Wax tablets listed joints repaired and collars replaced. A board near the store showed which spans were due for checks. Spare collars and tubes sat in shade, sorted by length. Brush bristles whisked dust from seats before closing time. The yard grew quiet as carts returned. Air cooled and carried a faint clay smell near the stacks. Archaeology around Petra preserves these parts. Tube fragments lie with collar sleeves near benches in the rock. Some pieces show slip films and thin lime wash inside. Edges carry wear from insertion and removal. Pipe benches cut into sandstone show mortar smears and seat marks. Stone sills across small ravines hold traces of thin vault caps. Inspection plugs appear in reused blocks near paths. The pattern fits early Roman decades and careful upkeep. Pipe strings linked covered channels to places channels could not go. They kept grade through walls, bends, and narrow crossings. They worked with collars that forgave small movement and sealed with thin mortar. They offered many small inspection points instead of one large opening. Gentle tapping on clay rang once, then settled. That ring meant the network could accept the next length. The thread moved on, quiet and steady, toward basins, tanks, and taps. When sun rose high, caps shaded the clay from heat. When wind climbed the cliff, vent caps turned grit aside. When a storm sent sand and leaves down gullies, pockets caught most of it before long runs. When rock moved a finger's width, joints flexed and held. Afterward, crews walked the route and pressed each collar. The line returned to its thin music along the wall. By evening, the work yard and benches looked plain again. Tubes rested on rails, collars and baskets, mortar bowls rinsed. A board listed tomorrow's bends and crossings. The wax tablet closed with a strap. The last test tap on a fresh length sounded clear. Then silence returned. In the cliffs beyond, the pipe strings kept their lean and their grade. Water moved through them in a small, bright thread, ready for the next junction down the line. In Petra, around 100 BCE, 100 CE, builders placed settling basins at transitions. A settling basin, a widened box that slows water so sand drops, stood where cliff runs met town lanes. Smaller silt traps, pockets that catch fine grains, sat inside covered lines. The aim was simple: protect channels, keep cisterns clear, and reduce repairs. Each part used stone, lime plaster, and short steps for access. A soft trickle entered, then thinned to near stillness. A cool draft carried faint grit smells along the lid. The basin plan followed the same pattern across sites. A narrow inlet arrived at one wall and spread into a wider box. The box depth exceeded the channel depth by a hand or two. The floor sloped gently toward a sump, a low pocket for settling. The outlet sat higher than the floor, so silt stayed behind. A small lip at the outlet trimmed turbulence. The water left thin and clear. A low water hush touched plaster and moved on. Materials were plain and local. Masons set a lining of dressed sandstone against compact fill. Lime plaster sealed pores in 2 or 3 thin coats. A bench ran along one side with steps for cleaning. A ledge near the rim supported a flat cover or short vault. In shaded corners, plaster kept a faint, cool feel. Tool marks lay in tidy bands from trowels and brushes. The lid opened with a dry knock. Air inside felt several degrees cooler than the path outside. Silt traps punctuated long covered runs where sand might collect. A trap widened the channel floor under a removable lid. Its outlet rose slightly, holding back the last rush of grit. Traps appeared after steep slopes, before bends, and at pipe transitions. Each trap allowed quick work with small tools. A scoop, a brush, and a basket handled most loads. Lids returned to their seats with a firm touch. The thread continued without pause. Some basins stood just below diversion dams near the city edge. These first tanks caught coarse sand brought by early surges. Others stood at the Saiku exit to protect urban lines. Inside the town, smaller basins guarded junction boxes near markets and workshops. A few sat above district cisterns to improve stored water. Placement followed topography and routine traffic. Steps were cut on the least busy side. Footfalls softened on worn treads beside the rim. Hydraulic ideas were simple and firm. Widening lowered speed. Lowered speed let grains fall. Heavier sand settled near the inlet. Finer silt drifted farther and fell near the sump. Baffles reduced swirl and protected corners from scour. Gauge notches marked safe levels during storms. Vent slots released trapped air under covers. These features worked together in small ways. The result was less load on pipes and cleaner water in tanks. Crews used short, repeatable motions to maintain the basins. After storms, inspectors lifted lids and checked the floor. A wooden scraper drew silt toward the sump. A soft scrape rose and fell in measured strokes. A scoop lifted the silt into a reed basket. A brush whisked the last dust into the corner. When the basket filled, rope creaked as it moved aside. Water at the outlet kept its thin, even line. Schedules matched the seasons. Before winter, teams inspected plaster skins and outlet lips. They repointed small cracks with thin, wet paste. During winter bursts, watchers stood near upstream basins. They listened for the steady hush that meant the box was not choked. After storms, crews made a circuit from high basins to low traps. Sherd tags recorded section and day in short strokes. At sunset, tags returned to a peg near the store. The yard fell quiet as baskets dried. Tools stayed simple and easy to carry. The kit included scrapers, scoops, short brooms, and a measuring rod. A hook lifted vent plates and small covers. A folding board served as a knee rest on damp plaster. A wax tablet in a leather wrap held counts and notes. Brush bristles ticked on stone as the last dust moved. Buckets thudded softly when set down. The work made few sounds, and none were sharp. Designers prepared for rare, larger surges without drama. Overflow notches sat above normal levels and led to lined spillways. Stone armor protected inlet corners from crowding flows. Relief cuts on the far wall allowed a safe bypass. After a strong event, crews walked the edges and felt for movement. Loose stones seated under a mallet. Outlets regained their lip. The basin emptied toward calm again. The plan favored steady recovery over large walls. Interfaces with junction boxes were clear and compact. Where a box split the line, a small basin sat just upstream. The basin removed sand before plug stones adjusted shares. Inside the box, a gauge notch named the target level. A mark beside the notch showed the last season's crest. Crews moved a plug by one ring to feed a lane. The lid settled back with a dry touch. Street sounds returned to their low murmur. Basins near workshops served extra tasks. Stone yards used wash water to cool tools and reduce dust. Small traps caught grit from sawing and dressing. The grit later filled holes along paths. Dye houses and tanners likely used overflow lanes rather than the main line. Their drains led to separate pits for settling. Such arrangements protected household cisterns from clouded water. Records stayed short and practical across these rooms. Construction steps repeated across the city. Workers staked the corners, then dug the box and set the floor. They keyed walls into bedrock where possible. They built inlet shoulders with a slight curve to spread force. They raised the outlet sill by a measured hand. They laid the cover seat and vent slots. Lime plaster went on thin and smooth. A final burnish closed pores. The empty basin gave a clean echo. When filled, it returned a soft, steady hush. Where pipes met basins, collars sat on benches inside the wall. A short sleeve bridged the pipe to the box face. Mortar rings sealed the joint without bulging. A light tap confirmed the set. A small pocket below caught fines from the collar edge. During checks, a finger traced the seam for leaks. If a hairline opened, a thin wash closed it. The joint hid behind plaster and kept quiet under shade. Evidence remains around Petra for this calm craft. Plastered basin walls stand near the SIQ exit and alongside lanes. Steps descend inside boxes cut from the sandstone. Outlet sills show wear along their upper edge. Vent slots and cover seats appear in partial rows. Sumps hold compact, fine deposits under modern dust. Archaeologists note tool marks, patch sequences, and gauge cuts. These traces fit early Roman decades and steady use. Basins improved water quality for storage. Cisterns filled with clearer supply and needed fewer deep cleanings. A gauge stone inside a cistern might show long periods between drains. Overflow from clean basins fed terrace gardens with less clogging. Roots and soil received slow water that carried little sand. Leaves rustled in the narrow shade. A soft rill moved under the beds. The city felt cooler where these lines ran. Training for basin crews followed the same plain style. New hands learned to read the floor's slope by eye and rod. They learned to pull silt without gouging the plaster skin. They learned to reset a lid so it did not rock. They learned to read a gauge notch and match it on the tablet. They learned to feel a sound outlet lip with a thumb. Corrections were small and made on site. The basin returned to work at once. Records used little space but held firm memory. A wall board near the store named basins due that week. Sherd tags rode with each basket and returned at dusk. Wax tablets tracked how many baskets left each box. A brief line noted which basins needed plaster within a month. The board changed to a new set each season. Paper rustle was rare. Stone and clay carried the notes, then rested. By late day, basin sites looked plain again. Lids sat flush. Vent plates lay tight against seats. The floor showed thin scrape lines toward the sump. Outlets shone with a faint wet band at their lip. Water sounded thin and even as it left. A soft scrape had lifted silt as the flow moved on. The path nearby held light dust and low voices. The network downstream was ready for the next clear, measured run. Across Petra, around 100 BCE, 100 CE, teams carved cisterns into firm sandstone. The hills rose in steps, and storage followed those steps. Upper tanks filled first and supplied lower quarters through measured outlets. The plan used height as power, turning slope into steady pressure. Channels, pipes, and gates tied each chamber to the next. Stone dust drifted while tools rasped in even strokes. The air inside stayed cooler than the path outside. Site choice began with simple tests and careful notes. Crews sought sound bedrock and a slope that faced away from wind. A line on the ground showed the catchment that would feed the inlet. A trial pit checked rock layers and drain behavior after a small pour. If rock kept water and did not flake, the site advanced. Cairns marked corners, and a cord showed the chamber axis. Charcoal numbers on stone held these choices for the next day. Excavation followed a steady order. Workers cut an access shaft or doorway, then widened the cavity. Picks opened rough faces. Chisels shaped faces smooth. A bench rose along one wall for steps and inspection. The floor tilted toward a low sump where fine silt would gather. In some chambers, a central pillar remained to support the roof. Where spans ran wide, rock ribs stood along the sides. Stone dust drifted in faint veils, then settled again. Chamber shapes varied by layer and need. Many were bottle-shaped with a narrow neck and broad belly. Others were rectilinear with rounded corners for strength. Height allowed volume without long roofs. Steps descended in short flights with safe rises. Niches held lamps and tools at measured intervals. The ceiling carried gentle curves that shed droplets toward the walls. All surfaces aimed for simple, strong lines that resisted stress. Inlet design protected the interior from grit and shock. A short forebay sat outside the door as a last settling stage. Screens and grooves caught leaves and twigs after storms. Beyond the screen, an inlet sill lifted water into the chamber without scouring. A splash slab on the floor spread energy from falls. When water arrived, sound changed from thread to quiet hush. Air cooled as the surface rose along the wall. Outlets used height to send water downward by measure. A discharge niche sat near the floor with a short pipe seat. A plug stone or board and peg device set the flow. When a lower tank filled, the outlet closed again. A second outlet, higher up, served city lines during repair or cleaning. Gauge notches cut into the wall marked safe levels across the year. The marks kept crews aligned when choices came quickly. Waterproofing used lime plaster in thin, repeated coats. Plaster mixed as burned limestone, clean sand, and sometimes crushed potsherd. The first coat pressed into cut faces to close pores. A second coat leveled tool marks, then cured in shade. A finish coat received a light burnish to make it harder. Joints at steps and ribs took extra care. A dampened brush woke any dry patch before new plaster. The room kept a faint chalk scent while coats set. Roofs and openings balanced strength and access. Where the chamber lay below a court, a capstone closed the neck. A lifting ring or socket allowed removal by lever and sling. Side door cisterns used framed jambs with locking lugs. Small vents near the crown released warm air and helped plaster cure. Later, vents kept musty smells out and heat down. The draft moved lightly through the openings. It made a low thread of sound against stone. Tiered storage turned hillside shape into a timetable. Upper cisterns filled during winter bursts and held reserve. Middle tanks fed daily lines and regained volume at night. Lower tanks smoothed peaks for markets and workshops. Plug routines shifted water downward in short, planned turns. Crews used sherd tags to track which outlet opened that day. A board near the store held the week's order. Rope creaked when a plug lifted from its seat. Distribution from hill tanks reached streets by gravity alone. Covered channels and ceramic pipes carried the thread along contours. Junction boxes split supply toward taps and courtyards. A gauge notch inside each box showed the target. A small turn on the plug stone met that mark. A lid closed with a dry touch. Nothing loud changed on the path above. Water found its level and moved on. Cleaning and inspection used the steps cut into the wall. When silt rose near the sump, crews entered with scoops and baskets. A soft scrape lifted fines toward the bucket line. A brush whisked the last film from the floor. In deeper tanks, a row of holes held a light scaffold. Workers scraped the lower half one day and the upper half the next. The routine kept surfaces sound without long drains. Lamp niches showed faint smoke at shoulder height. When a deep clean was needed, drains made the work safe. A small draw-off near the floor led to a waste lane. The lane discharged to a lined ditch outside town. Once levels fell, crews walked the steps and checked every seam. Hairline cracks received a wet wash and a thin smear. Sharp edges lost to erosion were rounded in a few strokes. The chamber returned to service after short curing. The echo rose slightly in an empty room, then steadied again with water. Structural care remained quiet and exact. Inspectors tapped pillars and ribs with a wood mallet. A clear note meant sound rock under plaster. A dull note marked a void that needed a drill and fill. In those places, a slurry pressed into the gap and set. Roof curves met walls in wide, easy radii that spread load. No large beams worked here. The rock carried its own weight. Tool taps and brush strokes stayed steady and small. Access hardware stayed simple. Wooden ladders rested on stone treads when extra reach was needed. Slings lifted capstones with a lever and a base block. A rope looped through the ring and down to a team in the court. A thin iron hook helped lift screens from grooves. A rod with marks checked depths against gauge notches. Buckets made from reed and hide handled wet fines without scraping. Sounds were soft. Rope rub, bucket thud, and faint water hush. Cisterns also cooled the network. Shade and mass kept temperature stable during hot months. Cooler water reduced vapor loss in downstream lines. It also felt steadier at taps in markets and courts. Fountains ran in thin strands during posted hours, then paused. Bathrooms drew from mid-level tanks on fixed days. Workshops used separate outlets to control dust and cut stone. Overflow from clean tanks fed garden beds below, where leaf rustle mixed with a soft rill. Seasonal work followed a calm cycle. Before winter, teams checked plaster skins, vents, and inlet screens. Levels dropped slightly to leave space for first storms. During winter bursts, watchers listened at vents for full, continuous sound. After storms, crews noted new silt and cleared forebays. In dry months, Deeper repairs and coatings took place. Plaster cured best in warm shade. Records stayed on sherds and wax, then returned to pegs at dusk. Archaeology around Petra preserves these rooms and their marks. Rock-cut steps descend inside broad cavities on hillsides. Lamp niches appear in regular rows along inspection routes. Plaster layers show sequences of repairs across decades. Gauge notches stand in pairs near outlets. Pick marks cross walls in bands that reflect steady labor. Carbonate films ring former water lines at calm heights. These traces fit early Roman years and the routines shown here. Numbers helped crews plan and neighbors understand. A rough capacity number, in round figures, sat on a board. The number guided ration and sequence during lean spells. A simple sign on the capstone named the tank and tier. Junction boxes kept the same names, cut as letters beside lids. When a plug moved, a scribe made a short stroke on the tablet. The strap closed the leaf with a dry sound. The notes kept order without speech. Connections to pumps were rare in this time and place. Gravity did the work because height was free. Where a lift was needed, a counterweighted bucket moved water a short rise. The device used a beam and a small pit beside the door. Rope moved softly over a wear stone. The solution stayed local and did not disturb the main plan. The chamber kept its role as a quiet store, not a show of power. Safety inside the chamber remained matter of fact. Steps had shallow rises and clean edges. Niches for lamps took low flames away from the face. A small board lay near the door for kneeling during repairs. When crews worked, a second person watched from the rim. The watch listened for a steady scrape, a steady voice, and a steady pause. If the sound changed, the rope moved at once. Work resumed after a short check. Interfaces with covered lines protected quality. A silt trap sat just before the inlet screen. A second trap sat just beyond the outlet seat. Both opened under small lids with ring pulls. After storms, those lids lifted first. A scoop cleared the pockets in a few strokes. The lids settled again. The main door stayed closed unless a deeper job was needed. These small acts kept large rooms clean for many seasons. Materials came from near at hand. Sandstone was the chamber itself. Lime came from clamped kilns using brush and scrap wood. Sand came from clean bars screened by hand. Potsherd temper came from broken vessels in town. Timber, rope, and hide served as tools, not structural parts. Nothing costly was needed in bulk. The value sat in slow labor and repeated care. Training followed the same steady pattern as elsewhere. New hands learned to judge slope by rod and eye. They learned to cut steps with even rises and firm landings. They learned to hear the wall change under a mallet tap. They learned to mix plaster thin and press it tight. They learned to keep a door covered when dust blew. Corrections were small, quick, and local. The chamber kept its role as a steady store. In use, these cisterns made the city predictable. Taps opened at known hours because pressure remained. Markets cleaned stalls with measured buckets. Bathrooms filled and drained on schedule. Workshops quenched tools without clouding public lines. Terrace beds received overflow in calm strands. The hillside, however rough, became a ladder of water. Steps led up. Outlets led down. The plan held through sun and wind. By late day, the rooms returned to quiet. Tools lay on the bench with a thin film of dust. A capstone sat flush, paint mark facing the court. A vent cover clicked into its seat. The steps held shallow scrape lines toward the sump. Stone dust drifted once more as a brush crossed the floor. Then the room rested. Above, the path cooled in shade. Below, streets waited for the night refill, delivered by gravity from the hills. Around 100 BCE, 50 CE, crews near Petra burned limestone and made lime plaster. The work took place in simple kiln yards set below the hills. A clamp kiln, a stacked, temporary kiln, rose from a level pad of earth. Piles of stone waited in neat rows beside fuel bundles. Ash drifted on light wind across the ground. Warm kiln breath moved through vents and left the air dry. From here came the coats that sealed cistern walls and joints. Quarry teams chose limestone with sound, fine grain. Blocks were broken into fist-sized pieces with iron wedges. Fuel gathered from brushwood, dung cakes, and scrap timbers. Workers sorted fuel by thickness to control firing. The yard held bins for stone, bins for fuel, and a shallow pit for ash. A water jar and dipping ladle stood near a slake pit. Tools were plain: shovels, rakes, tongs, and long poles. Footsteps pressed powder into the yard's surface. Kiln building followed a steady pattern. Crews laid a base grate of rough stones with air gaps. On this, they stacked alternating layers of fuel and limestone. The pile rose chest high or a bit more. Small flues ran from the base to the leeward side. A skin of clay and ash sealed the outside, leaving mouth holes low and high. Fire touched the base, then crawled upward through the charge. A low furnace hiss joined the quiet crackle of brush. Heat soaked the pile for a day and a night. Burning changed limestone into quicklime, burned limestone that reacts with water. Watchers checked draw by holding a hand near flues. They looked for steady pull and pale heat, not flame. A test pebble, taken with tongs, showed a chalky core when ready. Too soon meant waste. Too late meant dead burned stone that would not slake well. When the draw slowed, mouths closed with clay plugs. The kiln cooled in silence while ash settled in soft layers. Slaking came next in a safe corner of the yard. Quicklime met water in a slake pit, and heat rose fast. Slaking, adding water to quicklime to make lime putty, needed space and care. Workers added water in small pours with long-handled ladles. Steam lifted in white sheets, and then thinned. The lumped mass broke down into smooth paste. A wooden paddle turned the mix until lumps were gone. The pit's rim stayed damp to keep dust low. A faint tang hung in the air. Lime putty rested under a film of water for days. Rest aged the paste and made it creamy and strong. Sand piles stood ready nearby, screened through wicker. Some crews added crushed potsherd as pozzolan, a ground ceramic that helps lime set under moisture. Fibers, like chopped hair, sometimes reinforced first coats over rough joints. A mixing box held putty and sand in set ratios. Trowels lifted a sample and cut a ribbon. If the ribbon bent without tearing, the batch was good. Application began with careful surface work in cisterns and channels. Masons scrubbed stone with damp brushes to lift dust. They wet the surface lightly so plaster would grip. A scratch coat went on first, pressed hard into pores and tool marks. Lines ran in crisscross strokes to key the next coat. A brown coat followed to level the face and soften corners. A finish coat came last in thin passes. A smooth stone burnished the surface to close pores. Corners and seams received extra care. Sharp angles became small curves so stress would not collect. Inlet and outlet seats gained fillets that turned flow without undercutting. Rib bases blended into walls with broad arcs. Around steps, a shallow cove kept dirt from settling in hard corners. At the sump, the floor met the wall in one long sweep. Each move reduced places where cracks might start. Trowels made short, even strokes. The wet scrape sounded soft and steady. Curing protected what hands had made. New plaster needed shade and slow drying to gain strength. Crews draped damp cloths over fresh faces for the first days. Vents stayed open to move warm air gently. If a patch dried too fast, a worker misted it with a dipper. A chalky handprint showed an area still green. A ring test with a wood handle confirmed a harder set. After a week, the finish felt cool, even in warm air. A faint lime scent faded in the room. Repairs during 100 BCE, 50 CE used the same thin, careful steps. Inspectors walked routes and traced hairline cracks with a fingertip. They opened the line slightly with a small chisel, brushed it clean, and washed it. A thin slurry went in first, then a skim coat. Where water had stained, the damp edge was cut back to firm plaster. Joints around outlets received a fresh wash. Trowels smoothed the patch, and a light burnish closed the face. Brush bristles whisked crumbs into a pan. Records kept the work clear and repeatable. Sherd tags named tank, coat, and day. Wax tablets listed which chambers had first, second, or finish coats. A board near the yard showed kiln loads planned for the week. Buckets and paddles dried on racks in order. The slake pit held a shallow pool above the resting putty. A coverboard kept stray grit away. At dusk, the board met the rim with a dry touch. The yard went quiet except for low ember ticks. Plaster also served outside cistern walls. Covered channels gained thin skins under lids to seal joints. Pipe benches received a wash to keep mortar from powdering. Small vault caps took a burnished coat to shed dust and heat. Settling basins wore smooth interfaces that resisted scraping work. Across these places, the same paste and trowel marks appeared. The city's water lines looked plain, but their surfaces told trained eyes a full story. Quality varied with stone and fire, so tests stayed simple and firm. A slaked batch that felt gritty went to external coats, not to cistern skins. A batch that rang clear under a tap and cut clean under a trowel served inner coats. If a kiln load showed much dead-burned stone, those lumps became road base rather than plaster. Nothing wasted, but not all for water rooms. The best paste met the most sensitive surfaces. Kiln crews timed burns to match the season's needs. Before winter rains, more plaster went to inlets and first coats. During dry months, finish coats and large repairs took place in shade. The yard's schedule matched cistern filling and drawdown cycles. Cartwheels creaked once at the gate, then paused at the pile. A tally mark on the wax tablet closed each load in round numbers. The strap held the leaf flat. The tablet waited for the next line. Training for new hands stayed practical. Trainees learned to sort fuel, stack stone, and seal a clamp. They learned to read, draw by heat and by sound. They learned to slake safely and stir until paste ran smooth. They learned to mix with sand and sweep out lumps. They learned to press a scratch coat and close a finish coat. Corrections were small and made at once. By the end, a steady wrist and a clean trowel told the skill. Archaeology near Petra shows traces of these routines. Kiln scars appear as ash-rich patches with burnt limestone bits. Plaster dumps show chips from resurfacing jobs in pale layers. Cistern walls preserve bands of coats from different seasons. Burnish marks cross in short arcs near outlets and steps. Vent stones carry lime films where vapor passed during curing. Such signs fit early Roman decades in calm, repeated care. Tool lines remain clear where shade protected faces. In the city, finished skins changed daily use in quiet ways. Water tasted cleaner from tanks with fresh coats. Downstream lines carried less grit, which meant fewer clogs. Crews in markets used fewer scoops on basins after storms. Garden channels kept a brighter thread under lids. Workrooms washed tools without lifting plaster dust. The network held more water because walls did not seep. Pressure stayed steady at taps during set hours. By late day, the kiln yard returned to near stillness. Mouth holes rested plugged, only warmth rose in gentle waves. Ash drift lay thin across the ground where feet had passed. The slake pit showed a calm surface with a light skin. Trowels and paddles hung on hooks, their edges clean. A small pile of screened sand sat under a cloth. Warm kiln breath slowly faded from the vents. The coats made that week would travel uphill tomorrow, ready to seal stone and hold water. In Petra, around 100 BCE to 100 CE, hilltop tanks provided head. Head means the push gained from height. Higher water pressed down and moved through lines without lifting tools. Slopes around the city offered many levels for careful drops. Crews set tanks on rock ledges above lanes and markets. Channels and pipes linked them in a calm chain. Measured falls fed quarters far from the gorge. A quiet wind crossed the ridges, while water waited in shade. Planners began with simple rules of height and fall. A taller drop gave more push at the outlet. Too much drop could strain joints and lids. Too little left fountains weak and taps slow. Survey teams paced lines and marked grades with cords. A water level confirmed even declines from tank to street. Trial runs used small flows to test noise and speed. Gauge stones marked targets in round numbers. The slope became a tool, not a risk. Site choice for high reservoirs favored sound bedrock and clear roots. Crews looked for ledges that faced away from strong winds. A shortcut in the rock made a clean seat for each tank. Steps and a narrow walk allowed safe checks along the rim. Inlets arrived from upstream basins through covered runs. Outlets faced downward lines with good shelter. Overflow weirs stood ready near the lip. Air moved lightly through a small vent near the crown. Tanks followed the same calm design across the hills. A broad belly sat behind a narrow mouth or door. Lime plaster sealed walls and thin coats that cured in shade. A forebay outside the inlet caught the last sand. A splash slab spread force inside the entry. At the far wall, a discharge niche held a short pipe seat. A plug stone or a board and peg device set the flow. When work began, a muted hush replaced silence. The air felt cooler near the water face. Pressure needed control as well as height. Crews placed brake tanks on long drops to rest the line. A brake tank is a small box that receives flow and starts fresh. It reduced surge and guarded joints below. Where rock fell steeply, a short series of brakes kept pressure even. Inspectors read notches at each box and moved plugs by one ring. A steady thread left each outlet. The next box repeated the same task without fuss. Valves varied by location and craft. Many outlets used plug stones with simple shoulders. Some used a wooden gate within grooves. In a few busy sites, a small metal stop device may have worked. Scholars suggest bronze parts in later years. Keepers opened any device slowly to avoid shocks. As wood eased in its seat, a faint squeak rose and then settled. A quiet stream began against the stone. The tone stayed low, and even when the setting was right. Distribution lines left the tanks along contours. Covered channels carried water where benches allowed easy cuts. Ceramic pipes took over at tight turns and narrow crossings. Junction boxes split the thread toward district taps and courtyards. A gauge notch inside each box marked the target level. Plug stones met that mark by simple steps. Lids closed with a dry touch. Street dust settled outside while water moved inside in shade. Fountains and small basins relied on head for their form. A thin jet rose a short hand's height when pressure was healthy. A lip caught the strand and sent it down a drain to gardens. Public basins filled during posted hours, then paused. Market workers rinsed tools and hands without stirring silt. The sound stayed mild. A thin fall, a light kiss on stone, then hush. That steadiness came from hilltop tanks and measured drops. Household flow followed the same calm plan. Quarter lines reached lanes at set pressure. Courtyard taps opened on hours and filled jars without spurts. Rope creaked as jars lifted onto benches. Drains carried light spill to nearby beds. Where pressure sagged, a keeper checked a brake tank above. Often a trapped leaf or a shifted plug made the change. A short lift and a short wipe returned the tone. The stream regained its thin shine. Air management kept pressure true. High points along pipes held small vent caps. Vents released trapped air that would blunt the push. They also drew cool drafts under lids. Inspectors touched caps and listened for gurgle or hiss. If a vent clogged with fine dust, a hook lifted it free. A brush cleared the seat and the cap returned. The line sounded smoother afterward. Flow stones at outlets showed fewer bubbles. Safeguards handled the rare, strong pulse. Relief cuts near tanks led to lined spill paths. Boulders above lid seats broke force during bursts. Brake tanks below took pressure and slowed the thread. At steep corners, thrust blocks backed collars so joints would not creep. After a storm, crews walked the route from high to low. They pressed lids, eyed joints, and checked notches. Repairs were thin and quick. The system returned to quiet work. Materials and tools stayed familiar. Tanks were carved sandstone with lime skins. Channels were cut rock with stone covers. Pipes were fired clay with collar sleeves. Mortar was lime and clean sand. Tools were picks, chisels, trowels, mallets, and water levels. Measuring cords bore knots at steady spans. Shirred tags recorded sections and days. A wax tablet held counts of plugs set and lids lifted. The strap closed with a dry sound. Operation followed a daily timetable. Before dawn, keepers checked hilltop gauges and brake boxes. They set morning shares for markets and lanes. A valve squeak eased, and a quiet stream began. Midday, flows shifted to workshops and baths for short hours. Evening returned share to households and gardens. At night, lines refilled tanks by gravity from upper stores. Cool air moved along corridors. By morning, gauges showed planned levels again. Training matched the city's careful style. New hands learned to read grade by water level and cord. They learned to open outlets slowly and to listen for tone. They learned to set plugs by ring marks in low light. They learned to clean vents and reset lids without gaps. They learned to feel pressure at a spout with a palm. Corrections were small and made on site. The line stayed in service while a lesson finished. Evidence around Petra supports this organized height plan. Hill cisterns stand above lanes in clear tiers. Overflow weirs and gauge cuts remain near rims. Bench cuts for covered lines run along slopes toward town. Pipe benches and collar fragments mark steep transitions. Brake boxes appear as small plastered chambers near drops. Wear on outlet lips shows long, thin flow. These traces suit early Roman decades and steady routines. Records kept pressure predictable during lean times. Boards near stores listed tank levels in round numbers. Shirred tags named which brake boxes to check after a burst. A simple mark showed when a district share stepped down a notch. If a drought stretched on, fountain hours shortened first. Household hours held next. Notes stayed brief and plain. The network's order lived in small marks and repeated steps. Care for joints and lids protected head. Inspectors watched for damp bands beneath seats. A damp line meant a hairline crack or a loose shim. A thin wash of lime closed one. A new shim closed the other. At collars, a fingertip felt the seam for grit. A soft cloth cleared fine sand before a fresh wipe of mortar. A tap confirmed the set. The clay rang once and went still. Pressure held the seam without strain. Fountains received extra checks because they showed pressure in public. A keeper watched the jet height against a carved line. If the strand fell short, he walked the near break box. Often a notch adjustment or vent clear restored the mark. At closing time, the plug rose, and the jet thinned. A brush lifted any leaves from the lip. The bowl drained to a garden run. The plaza returned to low voices and light steps. Gardens also marked health down the line. Terrace beds liked slow strands, not bursts. If overflow arrived too fast, soil scoured at the gate. A keeper set a plug one ring higher. The thread returned to a thin rill. Leaves moved lightly above the channel. In late day, moisture rose as a cool scent. Above, the high tank kept its level for evening draws. The hill plan reached quiet roots and quiet rooms together. By late light, high reservoirs showed calm faces. Vents breathed softly along the crowns. Overflow lips stood dry with faint wet bands below. Depth rods leaned against steps with chalk marks clear. A keeper set the last chair for evening taps. A small squeak eased as the gate found its place. A quiet stream began along the lane. Under lids and caps, measured drops along Petra's slopes kept their pace. Height did the work while hands kept the order. Petra's main approach, the Sick, lay in a narrow gorge with steep walls. Short winter storms could send sudden surges down the channel. To protect people in lines, engineers built a diversion tunnel near the entrance. The system likely dated to late Nabataean works before 100 CE. It took high water away from the path and toward an outer wadi. Most days, only a trickle touched the walls. During bursts, the tunnel accepted the excess. Air cooled in the shaft with a hollow hush. Planning began upstream with careful reading of the slopes. Surveyors walked catchments and traced old flood marks on stone. They measured drops with cords and a water level. They set cairns to show where intake walls would stand. A trial trench confirmed bedrock at the chosen inlet. Across the gorge, a line of pegs marked the tunnel's path. The route favored sound rock and a gentle fall. Charcoal loops on the wall held notes for the next day. Sand drifted in thin sheets along the floor. The inlet structure worked like a calm sorting gate. A low weir raised the water surface during surges and guided flow. A head wall with side cheeks narrowed entry to the tunnel mouth. Screens in shallow grooves stopped logs and brush. A sill across the floor lifted the stream into the opening. Daily flow still followed the wall channels down the Sick. Only rising water reached the weir lip and crossed into the gate. The change came without loud sound, only a thickening hush. Tunneling used steady repeated work with simple tools. Crews cut a starting chamber into bedrock beside the inlet. From there, pairs advanced a narrow heading with picks and chisels. The cross-section stayed modest, shoulder height and a bit wider. Where rock was weak, masons left ribs for strength. Spoil left the face in baskets along a plank walk. A small vent shaft rose where rock allowed. When workers paused, cool air slid down the shaft. The draft made a hollow hush in the dim space. Surfaces needed strength where water would run hard. In tight bends, stone lining formed a smooth curve. Lime plaster sealed pores in thin coats and cured in shade. At joints, a cove spread load and reduced scouring. Steps in the floor slowed drops and broke force. Each step led to a shallow pocket that calmed the thread. Crews checked slope with a water level after every few spans. A damp brush wiped away dust before coats. The chamber smelled faintly of lime and wet stone. At the outlet, engineers planned for energy to leave without damage. The tunnel opened onto a stone apron built on bedrock. A stilling basin received the fall and spread the flow. Baffle stones set across the lip broke the push. Training walls guided water back to the natural course of the wadi. A relief notch along one shoulder handled extra rise. When storms eased, the basin emptied with a soft swirl. A fine film of moisture remained on the apron stones. The desert air dried the rest. The CQ's daily lines stayed separate from this flood path. Wall channels and covered runs carried routine supply along both sides. Curbs on the floor kept small rills away from feet. Cross drains sent minor puddles back to the wall lines. The bypass only worked when levels rose against the weir. In normal weather, the tunnel mouth sat dry and quiet. During a surge, its tone deepened as water moved within. Footfalls on the walkway stayed soft and even. Devices at the inlet helped crews manage special cases. A board and peg gate could trim early flow in shoulder seasons. A plugstone could close the mouth for brief maintenance. Screens lifted from grooves by iron hooks during checks. Watchers kept a rod with ring marks to read rising depth. A mark on the weir face showed the turn point for opening the gate. Important actions used small motions rather than force. A short lift changed results across the corridor. Maintenance followed a clear circuit after each storm. Inspectors walked from the weir to the outlet the next morning. They brushed leaves from grooves and reset screens. They scraped silt from pockets into baskets with wooden scoops. They checked plaster skins and pressed thin wash into hairline cracks. At the outlet, they reset loosened cobbles and wedged baffles. A wax tablet noted sections cleared and stones replaced. Brush bristles whisked the last dust from the sill. The route returned to readiness. For rare, stronger events, the system layered safeguards. Above the inlet, small check dams slowed the first rush. Along the sick, armor stones protected inner bends from crowding sheets. The bypass tunnel added length to reduce slope and speed. Downstream, the stilling basin and training walls guided the load away. If flow rose beyond a gauge notch, a relief cut took excess along bedrock. Afterward, crews traced the marks and set the same pieces back. Work stayed measured and low. Evidence on the ground supports this arrangement. Cuttings for an inlet and head wall sit near the gorge approach. Tool marks run in bands inside surviving passages. Lime plaster clings in shaded corners where sun was soft. Vent shafts open to the sky as narrow ovals in places. The outlet apron shows rounded baffle stones above a worn basin. Scholars suggest the main phase belonged to late Nabataean years, before 100 CE. Later repairs likely followed with Roman tools and mortar. Records kept order without long writing. Gauge cuts on the inlet named safe levels in round spans. A dot beside the notch showed last year's crest. Sherd tags rode in baskets tied to section names. A board at the store listed the post-storm route. A depth rod leaned near the weir with ring marks plain. At dusk, tags returned to a peg. The strap closed the wax tablet with a dry sound. The tunnel sat quiet again. Training prepared workers for careful, small choices. New hands learned to read slope by water level and string. They learned to clear screens without dropping debris back inside. They learned to spot hairline cracks and open them slightly before washing. They learned to reset wedged stones and test with a single knock. They learned to feel air in the shaft and smell damp plaster. Corrections were short and local. The line stayed safe during the lesson. During a typical burst, steps unfolded with little speech. Wind shifted and the first drops struck the cliff. Watchers moved to the inlet and checked the rod. When the ring reached the notch, the gate lifted a hand's width. Water crested the weir and slid into the mouth. The sick lines kept their small threads against the walls. The walkway remained usable, with a light rattle from screens. In the tunnel, the sound thickened, then steadied. Afterward, notes marked what to clear. Materials matched other waterworks across Petra. Bedrock sandstone formed most of the path. Lining stones came from nearby benches. Lime plaster came from clamp kilns in the foothills. Sand came from clean bars screened by hand. Iron tools included picks, chisels, hooks, and rammers. Rope slings and wooden levers moved heavy pieces. Nothing looked grand. The value sat in steady labor and planned return visits. The tunnel also cooled air near the mouth. Even in warm months, shade and depth lowered temperature. The draft moved from the vent to the inlet in a slow thread. It carried a smell of damp stone and faint lime. Workers paused there between tasks and listened. The sound changed with season and rain. On dry days, it was only a low breath. On storm days, it was a contained rush, restrained by steps and pockets. Farther down the system, gardens and tanks noticed the design's effect. Clean lines in town remained undisturbed by flood silt. Settling basins filled with their usual small loads, not heavy beds. Junction boxes needed only routine checks. The city kept its timetables for taps and fountains. A valve squeak eased, and a quiet stream began on schedule. Flood safety remained apart, doing its task in stone and shade. The network felt steady because each part kept its lane. By late day, the bypass stood ready for the next season. The weir lip was clean, with faint wet bands below. Screens sat in grooves with rings turned inward. The shaft breathed cool air into the inlet chamber. The outlet apron lay dry, with cobbles tight under wedges. Gauge cuts showed clear marks along the face. The wax tablet rested closed on the store shelf. Air cooled in the shaft with a hollow hush. The gorge held low echoes that soon went still. In Petra during 100 BCE, 100 CE, junction boxes divided water by need and time. Each box sat just below pavement level along central streets and lanes. A flat cover marked the spot with rings for a lifting hook. Inside, a calm inlet met a settling pocket and a measuring mark. One outlet fed a market, another served workshops, and another continued downhill. When keepers worked, tool clinks sounded once, then stopped. Water kept a soft hush against the plastered walls. Design stayed consistent so crews could move quickly between sites. The inlet entered high on one wall to reduce floor scouring. A shallow sump collected sand before any gate or plug device. A gauge notch, cut in round spans, showed the planned level inside. Outlets sat on the opposite side at slightly different heights. A vent slot near the cover released air and kept odors low. The cover seated on a dressed ledge with a clean, dry knock. Placement followed both slope and use. Surveyors paced grade along the Cardo and cross streets. They marked nodes near plazas, near shops, and near workyards that needed water. Boxes sat where carts could pause but not block passage. A curb lip kept wheel ruts from touching cover seats. Stone numerals on a side block named the junction in a simple series. A scribe's sherd tag repeated that number on the day's list. Construction used plain methods and sturdy materials. Workers cut a pit into sandstone and keyed corners into sound rock. Dressed blocks lined the chamber with tight joints. Lime plaster closed pores in 2 or 3 thin coats. A short ledge held the cover and vent plate. A settling recess deepened the floor near the inlet. A small splash slab spread any sudden thread. When empty, the box gave a clear echo. Filled, it returned a low, even murmur. Operation followed a timetable that matched city routines. Before dawn, keepers lifted covers and checked levels by the notch. A plug stone moved 1 ring to open or close a share. A wooden gate in grooves set fine adjustments when needed. Tool clinks marked each change, then silence returned. A brief note on a wax tablet recorded the setting. The strap closed with a dry sound. Street sounds remained steady: soft footfall, light cart creak, and a faint water hush. Inside the box, small features guarded quality. Screens in narrow grooves, stopped leaves, and straw. A pocket beyond the screen caught fine silt from overnight runs. If grit showed at the outlet lip, the keeper scraped the pocket first. A brush whisked the last film toward the sump. The outlet returned to a clean, thin thread. The vent slot carried a cool draft over damp plaster. The chamber smelled faintly of lime and wet stone. Markets drew regular shares from nearby nodes. Basins filled during posted hours and drained toward garden runs. Tools rinsed in shallow bowls without stirring sand. When the market hour closed, the plug rose by 1 ring. Flow stepped down, and the basins stilled. Workshops drew from separate branches to keep dyes and wash water apart. Stone yards liked steady strands, not bursts, to keep dust down. Junction boxes made those strands predictable with small motions. Household quarters received measured flow during set windows. A side branch from a box fed a lane with fixed pressure. Courtyard taps filled jars and troughs without spurts. If pressure thinned, a keeper checked the nearest upstream box. Often a leaf on a screen or a shifted plug explained the change. A short lift, a brush, and a reset returned the planned tone. The lane tap regained its thin, bright thread. Records kept the network calm across busy weeks. Each junction number matched a line on a board near the store. The board listed morning, midday, and evening shares in round figures. Sherd tags named which boxes a crew would service after a storm. Wax tablets tracked small changes to plugs and gates. The writing stayed brief and plain. Most memory lived in stone cuts, ring marks, and the order of the route. Maintenance stayed quiet and regular. After winter bursts, inspectors made a circuit from high boxes to low. Covers lifted, screens came out, pockets were scraped. Brush bristles ticked on stone as fine dust moved. Edges of the cover seat received a quick wipe. If a hairline crack showed in plaster, a thin wash closed it. A burnish with a smooth stone finished the patch. Lids returned to their seats with a dry, exact sound. Safety for people. And lines shared the same design. Curb lips protected cover seats from wheels. Cross drains kept puddles from reaching lids. Relief cuts on nearby channels bled excess during rare surges. Where streets narrowed, nodes stepped back into recesses with short thresholds. A keeper's hook and lever allowed lifting without strain. When tools rested, rings turned inward so feet would not catch. The street kept its even pace. Training for crews emphasized touch, sound, and sequence. New hands learned to lift a cover without chipping a seat. They learned to read a notch in low light and match a ring. They learned to scrape a pocket without gouging plaster. They learned to hear a healthy hush and a clogged rattle. they learned to write brief notes that matched junction numbers. Corrections were small and on site. Water never stopped for long lessons. Materials for upkeep traveled short distances. Spare covers lay stacked on wood rails at the yard. Plug stones weighted in bins by size with faint ring marks. Fibers, sand, and lime stood near the mixing box. Hooks, levers, scoops, and brushes hung in order. A depth rod leaned by the door, marked in hand spans. Carts carried only what a circuit needed. Tool clinks sounded once when racks emptied, then the yard went quiet. Integration with other features was direct and clear. A basin upstream from a box caught silt before shares moved. A fountain downstream showed head from the hill tank above. If the jet fell short of a carved line, the box settings changed first. If that failed, the upstream brake tank gained attention. Each adjustment moved by one ring, and then paused. Notes recorded steps in sequence. The city observed the results by sound and depth marks. Workshops near nodes showed these patterns in small ways. Dye houses likely drew from side lanes during off-peak hours. Tanners used separate pits and drains, away from drinking lines. Stonecutters rinsed blades at a low lip that returned water to gardens. Junction boxes kept these flows within their lanes. The same cover style, the same gauge marks, and the same ringed plugs repeated. Tool clinks and brief notes marked each adjustment. Evidence remains along Petra's streets for these quiet devices. Square cover seats survive where pavements are worn. Grooves for screens show in plastered chamber walls. Gauge notches appear near inlets facing the light. Sumps hold compact silt beneath modern dust. Peg holes lie in rims where lifting rings once sat. Fragments of plug stones and gate guides turn up in fills. These traces fit early Roman decades and steady routines. Seasonal shifts change settings in small steps, not large ones. In dry months, market hours shortened and garden shares decreased. Household hours held steady as long as possible. In wet months, boxes fed cisterns first, then plazas. Boards carried these changes in simple lines. The wax tablet closed each day with totals in round numbers. The strap left a faint mark in dust on the cover. Morning would bring the same circuit again. Communication stayed plain and visual. A notch beside the gauge showed last season's crest. 2 dots beside a number meant inspect after storms. A single cross meant cover seat due for repair. Crews pointed to marks more than they spoke. When a change was made, a brief note matched the mark. The system kept order by signs on stone, by ringed plugs, and by the sound of thin water. By late day, the route wound down without hurry. Final checks returned covers to clean seats. Screens sat in grooves with rings turned inward. Pockets were clear, and vents breathed a cool draft. Tool handles felt dry in evening air. A last tablet line marked the day's small movements. The strap closed with a quiet press. Under the pavement, junction boxes held their levels. Above, steps and wheels passed with soft sounds, while the hush within stayed even. In Petra during 100 BCE, 100 CE, household storage stood close to daily work. Courtyard jars kept clean water for cooking, washing, and lamp care. Small cisterns under floors held reserve for dry weeks. A lane tap filled buckets on posted hours, then rested. Families planned simple routines around those hours. Jars stood near drains, so spilled water returned to garden beds. Rope creaked as buckets rose. Water kissed the rim and settled. The courtyard remained cool, where walls cast steady shade. Courtyard layouts placed storage in quiet corners. Stone rings raised jars above the floor, keeping bases dry and stable. A short curb surrounded the group to stop sweepings from drifting inward. Lids were flat stones or fitted wood discs with simple handles. Cloth covers kept dust off during hours of wind. A small shelf nearby held scoops and a ladle. A drain line ran along the wall toward a narrow trench. Footsteps brushed the floor in even paths between storage, hearth, and door. Potters made large containers for these stores. A pythos, a very large storage jar, had thick walls and 2 or more handles. Some jars held about 50 liters, near 13 gallons in modern measure. Surfaces were burnished smooth, so they were easy to clean. Potters impressed simple marks near the neck to show batch or maker. Jars traveled on padded carts and rested on straw until set in place. When lowered onto the stone ring, a dry knock confirmed the fit. Cool clay kept water steady against heat. Small cisterns under rooms or courts added reliable reserve. Masons cut a cavity in firm sandstone, then sealed it with lime plaster. A short stair or step holes allowed inspection and cleaning. An inlet from the lane entered through a screen and small silt trap. A low outlet with a plug stone served a basin or jar stand. Gauge notches showed safe levels in round spans. Inside, the air felt cooler than the court. Faint lime scent met damp stone as water arrived from the node. Neighborhood taps stood along main lanes with clear schedules. Keepers opened them on fixed hours, often morning and evening in dry months. People brought buckets of wood, leather, or clay with cords. A simple spout filled each bucket to a carved mark. Tool clink sounded once as a plug moved, then stopped. A brief note on a wax tablet recorded the setting. Rope creaked as full buckets turned homeward. The tap paused between groups, so the line remained calm and steady. Carrying water home used simple aids. Some carried a single jar by the handles and a small pad. Others used a short pole with a balanced load, 1 bucket on each side. Courtyard thresholds were shaved smooth for easy passage. A wet line near the door showed the return path from the lane. At the stand, a scoop lifted water from the bucket into the jar. A cloth wiped the rim and cover. The bucket drained to the garden run. Sounds stayed low and regular. Kitchen routines depended on clean stores at hand. Water-rinsed grain, softened flatbread dough, and cooled pots from the hearth. A basin near the jar stand caught rinse water. The basin drained toward a small trench that fed a bed of herbs. A second basin held warm, soapy water for dishes. That water went to a separate drain so the garden stayed clear. The day moved by small measures: ladle dips, quick pours, and neat wipes. Clay surfaces felt cool to the hand. Lamp care also used a little water each day. Oil lamps burned better when wicks were trimmed and soot removed. A small bowl beside the jar stand held water for cleaning fingers and blades. A damp cloth wiped soot from the lamp nose without scratching. Another cloth covered the oil jar after filling to keep dust out. The routine took minutes and left the rim clean. The faint smell of olive oil mixed with cool clay and wet fiber. Storage jars stood quiet afterward. Washing and small baths followed predictable times. Hands, faces, and feet rinsed in shallow basins during midday rest. A ladle poured over shoulders after dusty work. Wet floors were swept toward the drain with a soft brush. In warm months, a jar on a shaded shelf cooled for drinking. In colder months, a pot on the hearth warmed a wash bowl. Public baths stood elsewhere for larger needs, but homes handled daily rinsing. The drain line carried a light thread to garden soil. Dry season rules changed hours, not order. When hill tanks stood low, the board at the node listed shorter tap times. Market shares stepped down, Household hours kept priority in simple ranges. Families counted fuller jars in the morning and planned meals around them. A sherd near the stand held short tally marks for the week. Neighbors listened for the keeper's tool clink that opened the tap. A quiet stream began. Then the line moved with steady patience. Cleaning and care kept storage sound. Once each month, a jar was emptied and scoured with sand and water. A brush lifted faint films from the inside. Then a rinse cleared the grains. If a jar tasted stale, a thin lime wash freshened the walls. Lids and covers were wiped and left to dry against the wall. The small cistern saw a scrape at the sump after storms. A scoop raised fine silt into a basket, and a brush cleared the last film. The plug returned with a dry seat. Tools for household water were few and plain. Scoops of wood or fired clay, a ladle with a narrow lip, and a brush of plant fiber did most tasks. A short depth rod with marks checked jar levels. A cloth ring kept rims clean while pouring. A small wedge under a jar foot corrected a slight lean. Each item sat within reach on a shelf or hook. Tool clinks sounded briefly and then stopped. The stand remained orderly in shade. Children learned the steps by touch and habit. They carried small bowls, not full buckets, along the lane. They watched levels at the tap's carved mark and stepped back. They wiped rims and placed covers gently. They counted tallies on the sherd and added one line. They swept a wet patch toward the drain with a soft brush. The routine held through seasons. The courtyard felt calm during those minutes. Water storage stayed full enough for the day's needs. Archaeology near Petra shows traces of this daily order. Jar stands survive as circular stone rings beside drains. Plastered small cisterns appear under floors with steps and sumps. Lane taps show spouts and bowl seats worn smooth by use. Gauge notches cut near outlets appear in round spans. Sherd fragments with tally marks turn up in house fills. Brush marks, scrape lines, and lime films remain on plaster skins. These pieces fit early Roman decades and steady routines. Household storage linked the high tanks to the last small tasks. Lane taps kept the timing. Jars kept the reach. Courtyards stayed cooler where clay, shade, and water met. Buckets left and returned at known hours. Rope creaked as loads shifted on shoulders. Water kissed the rim and slid down inside a clean jar. On shelves, tools rested in order after each short task. The lane grew quiet after the tap closed. The day moved on with steady, useful water at hand. Hillsides near Petra held stepped terraces during 100 BCE, 100 CE. Low stone walls created flat plots from the slope. Builders packed fill behind each wall, then topped it with shaped soil. A narrow path ran along the inside edge for care. A shallow channel followed the upper boundary of each plot. Simple gates let water leave the channel and enter a bed. Shade reached the soil in the late afternoon. Leaf rustle mixed with a soft rill under steady light. Water reached these plots from several quiet sources. Overflow from district cisterns arrived first, then paused in a small box. A weir, a low barrier that controls flow, set depth and speed. When level rose, a gate opened by one mark and released a thread. The thread ran along the terrace channel and met short inlets. After a set time, the gate closed and water rested. A faint, damp scent rose from the soil. Air cooled where rock faces shaded the path. Distribution inside each terrace used simple controls. A plugstone in a notch opened a branch to a bed. Earth buns, low ridges of compacted soil, formed small basins around roots. Water entered the first basin, filled to a carved mark, then crossed a notch. The next basin took its turn, and so on down the row. A spill lip at the far end returned the last trickle to the channel. The surface darkened in slow patches. No part rushed or scoured. Beds held plants that fit dry hills and thin threads. Herbs grew near the path for easy cutting and care. Vines climbed along wooden frames or rock posts backed by the wall. Shade trees stood at measured spacing in the deeper soil. Their roots sat inside circular basins with small inlets. Figs, pomegranates, and grapes likely filled these places. Leaves moved lightly as water touched their basins. The ground stayed quiet after the inlets closed. Soil making was an ongoing task with small tools. Workers mixed local sand with finer loam from pockets near wadis. Shovel strokes laid layers that drained but still held moisture. A thin mulch, a soil cover that slows evaporation, of gravel spread between plants. Potsherd chips sometimes covered the buns against sun. Manure and sweepings from markets enriched the top layer. After watering, the mulch glistened for a short time. Then it dried to a pale, even skin. Scheduling matched town hours in the hill's shade. Morning shares came before heat, and evening shares followed sunset light. Keepers watched a gauge stone beside the gate. A notch marked the day's allowance in round figures. If wind rose and air stayed dry, the share extended by one small mark. If cloud and cool air lasted, the share stepped down. Tool clinks sounded once during each change. The line settled to its thin, steady sound. Terrace walls received regular care to hold soil in place. Inspectors looked for small bulges and damp seams after each season. Loose stones seated under a wooden mallet with one firm knock. Joints received a wash of thin mortar where needed. Drain holes near the base stayed open so plots would not saturate. Brush bristles whisked soil from a spill lip. A scoop lifted any silt from the channel pocket. The path remained flat and safe for feet. Spillways carried excess from one terrace to the next. Each spillway was a short stone chute with a smooth curve. A small apron at the lower landing spread energy and protected the wall. During a storm, overflow passed along this chain without harming beds. Afterward, crews checked the aprons for chips and the chutes for grit. A soft scrape cleared the floor. A straight edge tested each curve. The system regained its quiet order. Some terraces held small header tanks for quick release. A header tank, a small raised supply box, stored a short reserve near the bed. It filled from the channel, then released through a plug to one plot. A thin cover kept dust out while the tank rested. Clay jars on stands also waited near corners for hand watering. Ladles moved a few scoops to a plant that needed a little more. The jar lid settled with a dry touch. The corner returned to shade. Tools remained light and easy to carry. A short hoe, a shovel, scoops, and a flatboard served most work. A depth rod with carved marks checked basin fills. A hook lifted gates and plugs with care. A small rake pulled gravel back across bare spots. A wax tablet recorded which terrace ran that hour. The strap closed with a quiet sound. The garden returned to leaves and a low thread along the channel. Urban lines and gardens stayed coordinated by simple rules. Household hours came first in dry weeks. Markets and workshops followed in shorter windows. Gardens took overflow and scheduled shares after those hours. If drought pressed, garden gates opened less often, and trees received priority. Basins for shade trees filled to the mark. Herb beds relied on jars and brief hand watering. Notes on the board near the node showed these steps. The order changed in small ways, not large ones. Archaeology near Petra preserves traces of these plots. Terrace walls climb slopes in steady courses. Channel cuts run along inner edges with seats for small gates. Plastered patches appear on spillways and aprons. Planting pits show circular basins around former trunks. Soil lenses reveal layers of sand, loam, and small gravel mulch. Sherd scatters collect near corners where jars once sat. These signs fit early Roman decades and careful upkeep. Care of vines and trees used simple, regular actions. Vines tied to posts with fiber lashes met shade without strain. Trees were pruned lightly after fruiting to ease water needs. Bunds were rebuilt at the start of each season. Inlets were cleared with a finger sweep before flow began. A rake spread gravel again where feet had worked the surface. Each act took minutes and saved water. The terrace looked the same afterward, only tidier. Paths between plots allowed quiet movement across the slope. Steps cut in rock kept a safe rise and clean tread. A low curb marked the channel's edge beside the path. Where paths crossed spillways, flat stones bridged the gap. Footfalls met smooth surfaces and then soil again. A thin strand in the channel stayed below curb height. The hillside held its shape as people moved slowly along it. Sounds remained small and even. In late day, light softened across the stone walls. Leaves flickered in a modest breeze. A measured thread slipped through a gate and into a first basin. The surface darkened to the carved line. Then the thread slipped to the next circle and paused again. The rill met gravel, then soil, then roots. After the hour, the gate closed with one quiet motion. Leaf rustle mixed with a soft rill under afternoon light. The terrace rested, held by walls, watermarks, and routine hands. Across Petra in 100 BCE, 100 CE, waterwork followed a calm timetable. Inspectors walked set paths at dawn, noon, and late day. Each path linked high tanks, channels, junction boxes, and garden lines. Tasks were small and repeatable, arranged by season and slope. Work logs, perhaps on sherds, tracked basins and pipe joints in order. A brief mark meant checked. 2 marks meant cleaned and reset. Brush bristles whisked silt in soft strokes. Sandals brushed dust on worn treads. The system stayed steady because steps returned the same way tomorrow. A modest yard near the foot of the hills served as base. Racks held hooks, scoops, brushes, and lifting levers in clear rows. Bins kept plug stones and collar sleeves sorted by size and ring marks. A mixing box waited for lime and sand, covered against grit. A wallboard carried the week's circuit in round numbers. Sherd tags hung on pegs for each section, ready to ride with baskets. A wax tablet lay beside the door for totals and notes. Morning air felt cool, and the ground showed faint ash. Dawn rounds began with head and height. 2 keepers climbed to hill reservoirs and read gauge cuts. If levels stood below the notch, break boxes stepped down by 1 ring. If levels rose, shares for markets and baths increased slightly. A valve squeak eased, and a quiet stream began where planned. Down the slope, inspectors opened junction covers and checked pocket depth. Tool clinks sounded once, then silence returned. Notes on the wax tablet matched junction numbers. Lids seated with a dry knock against clean rims. Inlet cleaning came next along covered channels and basins. Screens lifted from grooves with a hook and a careful twist. Leaves and straw fell into a basket lined with cloth. A soft scrape drew settled silt from the pocket to the scoop. A brush whisked the last dust toward the sump. The vent slot breathed a cool draft that carried faint, damp smells. When pockets cleared, screens slid back with rings turned inward. A single tally line on a sherd marked the task complete. Flow sounded thin and even as it passed. Pipe joints and collars received quiet care at mid-morning. Inspectors felt seams by fingertip along shaded runs. A damp band meant a hairline crack or loose shim. A thin wash of lime closed one. A new shim closed the other. Where a collar had shifted, a worker cleaned the seat with a cloth. Fresh mortar, thin and clean, lined the rim. The collar slid on with a light push and a wooden tap. The clay rang once, then settled. Ring marks on the plug showed the planned setting. The joint returned to quiet. Cisterns and settling basins followed a seasonal rhythm. Before winter storms, crews patched plaster skins and reset splash slabs. During dry months, finish coats cured in shade while tanks sat low. The steps repeated without hurry. Dampen the face, press the scratch coat, level the brown, and burnish the finish. Cloths kept surfaces moist while lime set. Gauge notches received a fresh highlight cut for clear reading. Inside, the air felt cooler than outside paths. A faint chalk scent rose, then faded as coats matured. Covered channels needed frequent, light inspections. Lids lifted from seats with a lever and a short block. A depth rod checked the line against carved marks. If grit lay on the floor, a brush and scoop cleared it to a pocket. Vents above long runs opened briefly to move air. Their caps turned aside wind and dust on closing. The cord line showed steady fall between stones. Lid settled back with a clean fit. The channel returned to its low thread under shade. Storm work followed clear signs and short actions. When cloud rose over the hills, watchers moved to diversion inlets. Weir faces were checked for trapped debris. Screens stood clear in grooves, and relief cuts lay open. Along the sick, armor stones received a test knock at inner bends. After the burst, a post-storm circuit began at high basins. Baffles were reset, pockets cleared, and notches read. A wax tablet held counts in round numbers. The route ended at the stilling basin, now drying in quiet air. Garden lines synchronized with town supply. After household hours, a keeper opened a terrace gate to the first notch. The thread reached a header tank, then moved by plugs across beds. A sherd tag hung from a post, naming that terrace's turn. If wind drew moisture fast, the gate rose one mark. If soil stayed dark, the gate stepped down. Later, overflow returned to the channel by a smooth spillway. A depth rod confirmed basin fills to the carved line. Leaves stirred as water touched roots, then rested again. Training kept skill inside simple tools. Apprentices learned to read slope by water level and cord. They practiced lifting covers without chipping ledges. They learned to scrape pockets without gouging plaster skins. They learned to seat collars with thin mortar and a single tap. They learned sounds, a healthy hush, a clogged rattle, a dull seam. Corrections were small and on site. Sandals brushed dust while steps repeated. Work stayed quiet so ears could guide choices. Materials moved on short, regular routes. Lime came from clamp kilns in the foothills, carried in sealed jars. Sand arrived screened in wicker, stacked under cloth. Fibers for mortar sat in bundles near the mixing board. Spare covers rested on rails, edges protected with straw. Collars filled baskets by size with faint ring marks. Carts creaked once at the gate, then stopped on wooden blocks. A tally cut on a sherd closed each delivery. The yard returned to shade and stillness. Records held the network's memory with little writing. The wallboard named sections due by day and season. Sherd tags rode with crews and returned at dusk. Each tag carried short strokes for steps done. The wax tablet summarized totals for flows, pockets cleared, and joints reset. A strap closed it with a dry press. Gauge cuts on stone and ring marks on plugs did the rest. These signs let workers read water without long words. The city's order lived in marks, not speeches. Repairs near people kept safety plain and visible. Curb lips shielded cover seats from wheels along busy lanes. Cross drains carried puddles away from walkways and lids. Short fences around work pits stood for as long as needed. Where streets narrowed, nodes stepped back into recesses. Hooks and levers lifted heavy pieces so backs stayed safe. When tools rested, rings turned inward to avoid stray feet. Footfalls returned to normal pace. The hush under covers stayed even. Seasonal planning set the tone for each quarter. Early winter prepared inlets, forebays, and diversion gates. Midwinter guarded cistern skins while the air stayed damp and cold. Spring cleared storm-borne silt and reset thrust blocks. Long dry months focused on finish coats, collar checks, and shaded curing. Terrace shares followed evening light. Markets took shorter windows when levels fell. Bath hours aligned with midweek refills. The range shifted by small marks, not wide swings. Evidence from Petra supports these quiet routines. Tool lines cross plaster skins in calm bands. Gauge notches appear near outlets and inside junction boxes. Cover seats show wear from careful lifting, not force. Sumps hold compact fines above smooth floors. Collar fragments bear mortar traces and thin shims. Shirred pieces carry tally strokes in clustered groups. These signs fit early Roman decades and steady, repeated care. The network appears in marks left by patient hands. By late day, circuits ended where they began. Crews returned shirred tags to pegs and tools to hooks. Scoops were rinsed, brushes hung with bristles down. The mixing board was swept and covered against grit. The wax tablet rested beside the board, strap closed. In the streets, stone covers sat flush, and vents breathed lightly. In the gardens, basins held dark rings at carved marks. Brush bristles had whisked silt. Sandals had brushed dust. The city's water lines settled into evening quiet, ready for tomorrow's round. Between 50 BCE and 50 CE, water reached waypoints near Petra's main approaches. These places offered troughs for animals and refill jars for people. Each station stood beside a road bend where slopes allowed a gentle fall. A shaded court held a header tank, a silt pocket, and short runs to basins. Stone posts marked entries, so carts and animals moved in single file. The yard felt cooler than the open track. Camel bells chimed once as ladles dipped and then stilled. Supply arrived by gravity from hill tanks above town. A brake tank at the station received the thread and calmed the push. A gauge notch on its wall set the share for the hour. When the plug moved, a thin stream crossed a splash slab and entered the header tank. Overflow returned to a lined ditch that rejoined the wadi. During low periods, the plug rose a ring to favor travelers. During crowded days, shares shifted by small marks. Water sounds stayed low and even. Troughs were cut from large sandstone blocks and lined with thin plaster. Each had a sloped floor for easy cleaning and a shallow lip for animals. Inlets entered high on the back wall. Outlets rested near the end. When full, a quiet rill crossed a notch to the next trough. A final notch led to a settling pocket. Crews brushed that pocket often so grit did not return. Hoof marks darkened the ground near the rims. Rope creaked softly as buckets came and went. Refill jars stood on raised platforms for quick hand service. A platform kept dust down and saved steps for the keeper. Large jars were sealed at delivery with flat clay caps. The cap broke cleanly with a light tap. Smaller jars sat open for ladle use. Each jar carried a simple sign for capacity. A short ladle with a narrow lip filled skins with few spills. A drain along the platform edge carried light runoff toward a garden strip. The edge stayed clean under shade. People and animals drew water at separate points to keep hygiene clear. Human drinking came from a small spout on the header tank. The spout fed a narrow basin that emptied quickly after each use. Animals drank from the large troughs nearby, reached by a side lane. A wash bowl for hands sat close to the spout and drained to a shallow pit. The pit linked to a covered line that avoided the animal path. Low fences guided movement without crowding. Sounds remained orderly and small. Station staff followed a simple schedule. Dawn opened with checks of the gauge notch and the first fill. Mid-morning favored animals from short trains and road crews. Midday brought a pause in the heat. The header tank refilled. Late afternoon served long caravans before camp. Evening returned to people first, then animals in smaller numbers. A wax tablet held times and totals in round figures. A strap closed the leaf with a dry touch. The court settled between windows. Fees and records used small signs and short marks. A sherd token, a broken pottery piece used as a marker, showed prepayment for one trough fill. Another token showed a refill jar. Keepers cut a tally on a hanging sherd after each service. At dusk, tallies and tokens matched the tablet lines. When surplus rose, prices eased for travelers in need. When drought pressed, shares tightened by one notch and hours shortened. Changes appeared as clear marks on a board, not long words. Road design brought water to where it was most useful. Stations stood near gentle slopes where animals could step off the track. A short spur led from the road to the trough court, then rejoined the route. Stone posts protected the header tank and spout from carts. A low wall shaded the court through late light. A tree basin near the outlet caught overflow for shade roots. Leaf rustle mixed with a soft rill along that edge. The court kept dust under control. Care and cleaning remained constant and calm. Brush bristles whisked silt from pockets after each window. A scoop lifted grit toward a basket lined with cloth. Trough floors were rinsed by opening the outlet for a moment. A smooth stone burnished plaster where wear showed. If a hairline crack appeared, a thin wash sealed it. Lids on storage jars were wiped and set back. The platform stayed dry except for a neat wet band near the drain. Tool sounds were brief and exact. Storage and security relied on plain hardware. A small storeroom held spare jars, caps, and rope. A bar across the door closed with a wooden pin. Lifting hooks and levers hung on pegs. A sand bin stood near the lane to dress slick spots. A brush and pan rested by the spout for quick sweeps. At night, plugs lowered, vents closed, and covers seated. Rings turned inward so nothing caught a passing foot. The yard's shapes looked the same at dawn. Animals approached in a practiced order. Camels came to the high troughs, donkeys to the lower ones. Keepers set a short rope across a slot to space heads. A shallow rise kept hooves out of the basin. The inlet ran gently while the outlet drew away what was not drunk. When animals stepped back, brushes cleared chaff from the lip. A ladle rinsed the corner and returned to its hook. Camel bells chimed once as the court grew quiet. Station teams trained by touch, sight, and routine. New hands learned to set the plug by ring marks. They learned to hear good flow versus wasteful rush. They learned to trim a ladle pour so skins filled cleanly. They learned to lift screens without dropping debris back in. They learned to cut clear tallies that matched tokens. Corrections were small and on site. The waterline did not stop for a lesson. The court stayed steady for travelers. Supply decisions linked station hours to city demand. Household windows came first. Markets and baths followed. Stations received shares after those, with a reserve for late caravans. On high traffic days, a board in town added an extra window at the approaches. A runner carried the note to the station and back. The plug rose by one ring at the posted time. The header tank topped off, then the troughs filled in order. The change made no large sound. Evidence near Petra supports this calm design. Worn trough blocks remain along approach spurs. Lined pockets sit beside short aprons. Gauge cuts appear on low tank walls with neat rounded marks. Jar platforms show drain slots and plaster patches. Stone posts stand in pairs near road bends. Sherd scatters collect by shade walls where tokens and caps once lay. These traces fit early Roman decades and steady service to trains. Seasonal shifts changed work in small steps. In winter, screens were checked before short bursts, and waste lanes stood open. In spring, plaster patches cured well in cool air. In midsummer, hours moved earlier and later to avoid heat. During dry spells, overflow to the tree basin paused, and the notch stepped down. When rains returned, the basin filled again, and shade recovered. The board near the spout carried these changes as simple lines. The station also helped trade in quiet ways. With water ready, trains halted less inside town. Loads stayed balanced because skins were filled to clear marks. Animals left rested and steady. Drivers used the platform to mend ropes and check packs. A shallow bench along the wall supported satchels during refills. When the plug lowered, the yard emptied in order. Dust followed feet back to the track, light and even. At day's end, closing followed a fixed order. Trove outlets opened briefly and then shut. Screens lifted, brushed, and returned to grooves. Pockets cleared and baskets emptied on the spoil heap. The header tank settled below the notch and rested. Lids sat tight on storage jars. The spout bowl drained and dried. A last line on the wax tablet matched tokens and tallies. The strap closed with a soft press. Air cooled along the wall. By evening light, the approach looked plain again. The road curved past stone posts. The court showed damp bands where work had been. Tree leaves moved above a small, dark soil circle. The brake tank's face held its gauge cuts, easy to read tomorrow. The plug sat at its lowest ring. Camel bells faded beyond the bend. Inside the court, ladles hung, brushes dried, and jars waited. The surplus of the city had reached the road and returned in quiet order. Across the last century, survey and excavation mapped Petra's water lines and stores. Teams walked slopes, noted cuts, and drew plans of channels and cisterns. They measured drops, wall heights, and plaster skins in calm detail. Flags marked edges of features beside worn paths. A grid set points for drawings and photos. Paper rustled as notes filled in neat lines. Small brushes ticked gently over compact soil. The record grew layer by layer like the network itself. Field survey began with simple tools and steady steps. Measuring tapes and a water level traced grades along benches and walls. Later crews used total stations and GPS to repeat the lines. They drew the same shapes with finer control. Stone lids, vent caps, gauge cuts, and outlet lips entered the plans. Each sign added a point to the map of supply. The sick, the hills, and the streets linked as one picture. A pencil made soft marks on clean sheets. Excavation opened narrow windows into the water system. Trenches crossed channels at right angles to show their form. Cut rock beds appeared under lime mortar and thin plaster coats. Silt lay above in thin, flat bands from slow flow. Flood layers showed coarser sand and small pebbles. A trowel edge traced joins between seasons. When a lid seat emerged, its surface showed polish from many lifts. A brush cleared the last dust from a seat groove. The trough below remained quiet and cool. Cistern rooms told longer stories with calm signs. Crews cleared fill-in stages, keeping each layer in separate baskets. Steps appeared first, then lamp niches and smooth walls. Plaster layers stacked in bands across decades. A finish coat shone faintly under low light. Gauge notches cut near outlets matched those seen in town nodes. A ring of lime scale, a thin mineral film from past water lines, circled the walls. The air stayed cooler inside. A faint lime scent rose from damp patches. Repairs and reuse stood out where plaster changed in texture. An early coat held fine sand and small fiber. A later patch used crushed potsherd as pozzolan, ceramic that helps lime set. Edges stepped cleanly where masons had cut back to firm skin. Burnish marks crossed at new angles where a different wrist had worked. Tool marks on stone ribs shifted direction between phases. Such joins placed work into ordered time. Many rooms showed Roman fixes on Nabataean bases. Dating relied on simple anchors that sat where water paused. Sherds from jars and bowls lay in silt pockets beside inlets. Coins appeared in drain cleanouts and near outlet lips. Lamps turned up on steps inside inspection shafts. Wood charcoal, caught in early fills, gave radiocarbon ranges. Stratigraphy, a stack of soil layers by time, tied these finds together. Scholars compared forms to known sets from nearby towns. Dates settled into round ranges rather than sharp points. Early Roman years often framed the last repairs. The Sicci carried clear evidence of control and safety. Channel cuts along the walls showed plaster skins with screen grooves. Gauge notches faced the light near bends. A diversion tunnel near the entrance kept flood marks low on the walkway. Steps and small pockets inside the tunnel broke force. Stilling basins downstream showed baffle stones and smooth aprons. Pick bands inside the passage ran level for long stretches. Each sign matched methods seen across the network. Distribution nodes lay just below pavements and kept their shapes. Square cover seats survived at street edges. In some places, lifting ring holes and vent slots still showed. Inside, plastered walls bore gauge cuts and small sumps. Sediment rose in thin layers, each with fine grit and plant seeds. A scrape line formed a neat oval inside the pocket. The pattern repeated from box to box. Notes on plans named them in a simple series that traced the main streets. Garden terraces preserved water order in soil and stone. Retaining walls stepped across slopes in steady courses. Channels ran along inner edges with small gate seats. Spillways curved between levels with smooth landing aprons. Planting pits showed circular basins around tree roots. Soil lenses held fine layers of sand, loam, and small gravel mulch. Grapevine stems and fruit pits turned up near frames. Overflow beds sat where channels ended. Their surfaces darkened in round patches. Workyards left quiet debris that matched the watercraft. Ash-rich patches marked clamp kilns in the foothills. Burned limestone bits mixed with charcoal and pale dust. Plaster dumps lay near slopes, stacked by tone and grit size. Pipe fragments showed collar sleeves and rim wear at joints. Mortar stains on collars matched thin seat repairs in the field. Shaped splash slabs appeared reused as paving stones in later paths. These piles read as ledgers of material and time. Quarry faces and tool marks explained how rock held water. Channels followed bedding planes that drained well and stayed strong. Chisel rows along cuts ran straight and close. Where roofs spanned wide inside cisterns, Ribs stood proud from the walls. Their faces carried pick bands that wrapped in calm arcs. Pillar sides kept even tap tones when tested with a wood mallet. Such details showed cautious work meant to last. The sound of tools returned in faint echoes. Recording methods stayed careful and repeatable. Crews drew sections with heights, widths, and coat counts. Scales sat on each sheet in round numbers. Measured photos captured wall faces with a frame and target points. Later, 3D models tied drawings to slopes and streets. Field books kept daily logs in short sentences. A line might read, Box 7, pocket scraped, 2 coats seen, gauge notch fresh. Paper rustled on boards in light wind. Clean hands turned pages with care. Conservation followed from that record and stayed modest. Small patches of lime mortar closed hairline cracks to slow erosion. Loose lids were reset on seats with thin shims. Vents gained simple covers that let air pass, but kept grit out. Runoff broke around features rather than across them. Signs with plain drawings helped explain grades and gates. Repairs used like for like, lime for lime, stone for stone. The goal was not new shine. The goal was a steady face. The map that grew from these traces linked parts across the city. Hilltop tanks set head for lanes below. Brake boxes calmed long drops. Junction boxes split shares to markets and courts. Household taps matched hours on boards and wax tablets. Gardens drew overflow and kept shade cool. Waypoints on the approaches served passing trains without waste. Repairs in early Roman years kept the plan working. Later reuse still followed the same paths. Evidence also showed pauses and change after the main period. Silt rose higher in some channels where care had slowed. A lid seat chipped where covers lifted less often. A cistern neck held a fill of trash from a later century. Yet even there, plaster skins stayed tight in lower bands. Gauge notches remained readable in low light. The watercraft endured beyond one rule or year span. Its marks stayed plain for anyone to measure. In the trenches and rooms, the work remained quiet. Trowels moved soil in thin slices. Levels were read at eye height, then noted. A brush made soft strokes along a cedar notch. Bags closed with twine and a small label. The day's plan met the ground in steady order. Finds around Petra mapped repairs and later reuse into early Roman years. Small brushes ticked gently over compact soil. The record settled like water in a still basin, clear and calm. A plain bench stood in evening shade beside a paved lane. Tools lay in order: a hook, a lever, a scoop, and a brush. A depth rod leaned against the wall with simple carved marks. A small box held shims and thin wedges for joints. The bench top showed smooth wear from years of light tasks. A faint grit line crossed the edge where lids once slid. Air moved softly through the entry and cooled the room. On the bench, a small balance scale rested on a wood pad. 2 shallow pans hung from a beam with neat pivots. Stone weights sat in a row, each with a scored number. The scale checked lime for a patch and sand for a thin wash. It weighed cloth caps for vents and fiber for mortar. The beam tipped, steadied, and then returned to level. Metal touched metal with a small click that faded. A covered channel ran just beyond the door along the lane. Stone lids sat flush on a dressed seat with tight joints. A vent cap released a slow thread of cool air. Under the lids, water moved with a low hiss. The hiss told of steady fall from hill tanks to town. A keeper lifted one lid, checked the depth, and closed it. The seat met stone with a dry, exact sound. Height still set the network's calm force across the slopes. Hill reservoirs kept head for morning taps and evening shares. Brake boxes on long drops rested surge and guarded collars. Gauge notches framed levels in round spans, easy to see. When a plug rose one ring, the tone changed slightly. When it fell again, the thread returned to a thin hush. Flow reached lanes without strain on joints or seats. Along the narrow gorge, wall channels kept routine supply secure. Their inner skins held screen grooves and small sumps. The bypass tunnel waited near the approach for rare storms. Steps inside the passage broke force into short pools. A stilling basin downstream spread energy on a smooth apron. In dry weather, the passage kept a hollow hush. Footfalls on the walkway stayed light and even. Across steeper corners, ceramic pipes linked benches and crossings. Collar sleeves joined lengths and allowed gentle bends. A thin mortar bed supported each joint and shed grit. Vents at high points bled air that would dull the push. A fingertip felt seams for damp bands at noon checks. A wood tap confirmed a clean seat on a collar rim. The pipe ran quiet once more. Settling basins waited at changes from cliff runs to streets. Shallow pockets caught sand before any gate or lip. Screens lifted by rings, then slid back in narrow grooves. A splash slab spread strands and saved plaster skins. A scoop raised fine silt into a lined basket. Brush bristles whisked the last film toward the sump. The basin returned to a mild, even murmur. Cistern chambers held reserve behind shaded walls of sandstone. Steps allowed safe entry for inspection and cleaning. Lime coats sealed pores in thin layers that cured in shade. Gauge cuts beside outlet seats kept levels legible in low light. Fillets eased corners so cracks would not begin. A test burnish closed the finish and left a faint shine. Air inside felt cool and smelled lightly of lime. In the streets, junction boxes split shares for daily use. A cover lifted to show a pocket, screens, and outlets. A notch set the planned level, with a dot for last season's crest. Plug stones moved by ring marks for small adjustments. A brief tool clink marked each change, then quiet returned. Lids seated on clean rims with inward-turned rings. The thin hush inside stayed steady. Household taps opened on posted hours and dry months. Buckets met a spout with a carved mark for the fill. Rope creaked as loads shifted toward thresholds and stands. Courtyard jars held cooking water, washing water, and lamp water. Lids settled with a dry touch to keep dust out. Drains carried spills to small garden runs. The work took minutes and left the floor clean. Beyond the lanes, terraces stepped across the hills in neat lines. Channels followed inner walls and fed basins around roots. A gate rose one mark to start the thread, then paused. Herb beds darkened in narrow bands and then rested. Vines drew light strands that did not scour soil. Shade trees filled to the carved line and cooled the path. Leaf rustle mixed with a soft rill under late light. At road bends outside town, waypoints served passing trains. A brake tank calmed the share before troughs and jars. Troughs filled in order and drained through shallow notches. A platform held sealed jars for clean refills. Ladles dipped and rose with little spill. The court stayed tidy with brush and scoop. Camel bells chimed once, then stilled in warm air. Crews kept this order by paths, tools, and brief notes. Inspectors walked from high to low and back again. Inlets cleared, pockets scraped, joints reset with thin wash. Screens returned to grooves with rings turned inward. Sherd tags carried tally strokes for each step done. A wax tablet closed with totals in round numbers. Sandals brushed dust along worn treads. Season by season, the same small tasks held the whole. Early winter checked weirs, forebays, and diversion mouths. Midwinter favored curing coats under cloth and shade. Spring cleared storm sands from pockets and aprons. Long dry months watched collars, vents, and covered seats. Garden gates opened late as cliffs gave evening shade. Bath windows matched refills near midweek. The plan moved by one mark at a time. Archaeology read this plan from cuts, coats, and quiet finds. Gauge notches matched across cisterns and street boxes. Plaster layers told of patches in early Roman years. Pipe collars showed thin mortar seats and faint ringware. Trough blocks at approaches kept polished lips from long use. Shirred groups held tally strokes by posts and platforms. The same shapes returned in many places. The record and the ground agreed. The bench near the lane gathered these threads in one view. The scale weighed sand for a small patch near a joint. A lid lifted and settled with one clean motion. A vent cap turned to let warm air drift out. A brush lay bristles down beside the scoop. The depth rod rested against the wall with marks visible. Outside, the covered channel kept its low, steady hiss. Across 1 century, the network's reach stayed practical and calm. From upland catchments to narrow gates and inner beds, each part fit. From hill tanks to break boxes and junctions, height did the work. From household taps to terrace roots and roadside troughs, shares moved. Repairs used thin coats and brief taps rather than force. Records used short marks and simple numbers instead of long words. The city kept steady water with repeated steps. By evening, light faded from the lane stones and walls. Lids sat flush. Vents breathed slowly under still caps. The bench held dry handles and clean edges in order. The balance beam rested level above quiet pans and weights. A faint breeze crossed the entry and carried cool dust away. The covered channel whispered under its seat. The day's round stood complete and plain. The film paused on these objects that carried the system. A bench with its tools, a scale with its weights, and a covered line. Together they showed planning, care, and small means. Petra's channels and cisterns kept a desert city steady for years. Methods endured because they were simple, readable, and shared. The plan lived in stone cuts, plaster skins, and measured drops. The city's water moved forward in quiet order. The camera held the bench while notes rested and tools stayed still. It watched the scale while pans balanced above the wood pad. It followed the covered channel while the thin thread continued. Evening air cooled the room and the lane beyond. Low water hiss, soft tool taps, and a light breeze made the scene. The film let those sounds continue for 1 to 2 minutes. Nothing shifted except small currents and fading light.